Mesdames et messieurs, chers collègues, chers amis, je suis Yoporeka Somé. Je suis professeur à l'Université des Kimati de Nyeri, au Kenya. Et je vous souhaite la bienvenue pour cette deuxième session du webinaire de notre groupe de travail sur les langues africaines. La première session a eu lieu le 29 septembre dernier et vous pouvez d'ailleurs retrouver l'enregistrement de ce webinaire sur le site de Cora. Donc, ces deux webinaires sont co-organisés par Cora et le Center for African Renaissance Studies de the Kimati University of Technology sous le thème de la circulation des langues africaines dans l'espace public africain. Cette thématique me fait penser à un court article publié par Cheikh Anta Diop dans le courrier de l'UNESCO en 1982 et intitulé « Les trois piliers de la culture ». Les trois piliers de la culture. Cheikh Anta Diop y affirmait d'emblée que, je cite, « l'identité culturelle d'un peuple est liée à trois grands facteurs, historiques, linguistiques et psychologiques ». Puis il ajoutait qu'il était difficile de dire lequel de ces facteurs, linguistiques, historiques et psychologiques, était le plus important. Et tout de suite, il citait un passage de Montesquieu qui dit ceci, je cite, « Tant qu'un peuple vaincu n'a pas perdu sa langue, il peut garder espoir. » Je répète, « Tant qu'un peuple vaincu n'a pas perdu sa langue, il peut garder l'espoir. » Et il concluait donc que la langue apparaît comme l'unique dénominateur commun, le trait d'identité culturelle par excellence. Donc, je ne voudrais pas garder la parole plus longtemps. Je voulais simplement, par ce bref rappel, dire d'où nous venons en tant que continent et en tant que peuple. Je voulais surtout faire remarquer que même si nos langues africaines peinent encore actuellement à trouver leur place dans l'espace public, elles existent bel et bien, parce qu'en tant que peuple, nous aurions pu disparaître plusieurs fois au cours du millénaire précédent. Cependant, aujourd'hui, on peut constater que l'Afrique est l'un des endroits au monde où le plurilinguisme est le plus pratiqué. Autrement dit, et concrètement, il est très rare de trouver aujourd'hui un Africain qui ne parle qu'une seule langue. Donc, je remercie l'ensemble des membres de notre groupe de travail pour le climat serein, agréable et studieux que nous avons su créer pour mener à bien cette recherche et qui, je l'espère, n'est que le début de notre aventure commune. Voilà. Sur ce, je vais inviter le premier intervenant à prendre la parole. Now, let me call to the floor our first presenter, Muyao Kilolo. So, Kilolo is the youngest member of our group. He's a PhD student, and he has already done a number of good achievements, both academic and non-academic. So Kilolo is the founder and editor-in-chief of Ituika, a literary platform devoted to African languages and translation. He also works as the project officer of the Ngugi wa Thiong'o Foundation and also the director of the Safal Cornell Kiswahili Prize. Each of these projects are in service of African languages. His own writing is his mother tongue, Kikamba, and he has published in the 23rd issue of Absent. And the title of his communication today is Creating Online and Physical Structures that Strengthen the Teaching of African Languages, a case of the Ituika Literary Platform. So, Kilolo, you are welcome.
Thank you very much. I just woke up. It's 6 a.m. I'm currently in California, so it's quite early in the morning here. But I'm very happy to be joining everyone. as Professor Somet has mentioned, today I will be speaking about the Africa Teachers Database that we have created with Etuika. And just as an introduction of the platform, Etuika is generally a literary platform that is devoted to African languages and translation. And we recently shared our first database to the support of the development of African languages. And the platform's African Languages Teachers Database is generally conceptualized as a resource to connect teachers and learners in various African languages across the continent and the diaspora. So hopefully this is a resource that will contribute to the strengthening the teaching of African languages and creating structures that that can enhance the process of teaching, especially now that there's a lot of online and Zoom instruction. And in that way, we can stop to speak about language learning only when we speak about dominant European languages. So the platform's efforts will remain geared towards building a global architecture of African language teaching and making resources readily available to African language programs and learners from around the world. So today I'll try to contextualize the African language learning by reflecting on the thinking behind the formation of the database and what it means to be teaching African languages, especially online. And to do that, I'll go back to my relationship with school and learning because I feel it's important. My understanding of what led to the formation of the Etuika African Languages Teachers Database. Many years have now passed since I was in high school, but I remember two distinct experiences that have stayed with me since that time. And I'm going to tell a story or two throughout my presentation. And I remember as a student from what was a provincial school, and we were invited to a national school once. And a group of 8 prefects from our school had been chosen to attend a training at a national school. And there was an instructor, or maybe what I would call a motivational speaker, was invited to speak to us about the concept of excellence and critical thinking. And these things, she said, would be helpful to us not only as young scholars and leaders, but for the rest of our lives. And as a young dreamer who wanted to conquer the world through scholarly exploits, I was very impressionable. I have very scanty details of the attestation of our background, but one statement has stuck with me all these years. And if you wish to be a critical thinker and excel as a student, this is what she told us, then you have to discipline the way your mind thinks, in which language your mind thinks. So she said that you cannot score a straight A if you do not train your mind to think exclusively in English, which was the language of instruction, hence the language of examination. I read an article recently that says that this kind of thinking is based on the belief that certain internationally important languages, and I say important in quotes, give children a competitive advantage later in life. And this experience of mine is not isolated in any way. Many children in Kenya, and I think in many other countries, are offered the same kind of advice all the time. So in our Kenyan schools, English is primarily the language of instruction. And again, it's true for many African countries where education is still rooted in the colonial education system, and European languages are the primary instruction tools. In fact, UNESCO Institute of Lifelong Learning notes that our continent remains the only place where most of the children start schooling using a foreign language. The effect is that instructions in our schools continue to be done in pre-independence and colonial language policies, which is catastrophic to many that never get to reap the benefits of knowing their mother tongue. we have Kiswahili in Kenya as a second language, and it's taught from lower tertiary school to high school, and only as a subject, even though it's the most widely spoken language. In Tanzania, this language has been used effectively as a language of instruction, but in Kenya, students are just allowed to study it up to university if they so wish. So in a sense, this is also an official language that is just been made into a subject that many do not feel that there's a very urgent need to prioritize. So to excel, going back to my story in high school, is that this lady told us that we must think in English. And my mother tongue, the most natural language to me since childhood, did not even feature in this conversation. And so, inspired by the grand idea of excellence from the national school where I sat and listened to the speaker, I sought to think exclusively in English from that moment on. So I failed as a young student to apply one primary thing to language and learning. And this is what I also read from Nishanti, who wrote an article about learning your mother tongue as a young person. And this author emphasizes that a person's mother tongue is central in framing individuals' thinking and emotions. The emphasis points to the fact that effective learning is significantly advanced when one has a grasp of their mother tongue. Yet because of the information drilled into me and many other school children since the very beginning of our schooling, I felt ashamed when I caught myself thinking in Kikamba, let alone wishing to learn it at any sufficient depth. So the following year, I was now a school captain, and we were invited to yet another national school in Nairobi for yet another training. This time I had a full year of thinking exclusively in English. So I walked into that hall full of impeccably dressed senior prefects from across the country with the confidence of a young man whose English mannerisms were now well cultivated. Beside me sat the school captain of Starehe Boys, and on the other side was the Kenya High School. Starehe Boys at that time was the most revered high school in the country, and seated on the same row as well are the captains of Kenya High School and Lenana School, and many other captains sat in the same row. But I remember this because of really what happened after that. So the facilitator on that session asked all the school captains to stand up, and then asked us all to shout out our respective school mottos out loud. The Lenana school captain shouted, "Nihil praeter optimam," and the Kenyan high school captain shouted, "Severe est regnea." I don't know if these pronunciations are right. This is in Latin, and I would later learn that these Latin phrases meant nothing but the best, right? And to serve is to reign, respectively. So beside me, the Starehe Boys captain, whose voice rose quite high and firm, shouted, "Natulenge juu," which translates as "let us aim high." So coming in next, I felt the need to sound equally sophisticated. My school motto was in Kikamba, my mother tongue, which is my mother tongue, all right? But instead of shouting this phrase, "Uiwimbe," powerful words in my language, Kikamba, I opted for the less impactful loose translation of the same into English, and I shouted, "Wisdom is ahead." A motto would have sounded incredibly nice in Latin. This is what I thought, or maybe great in English. The Starehe captain had used Kiswahili, but my mind did not gravitate towards Kiswahili, a Kiswahili translation. So the audience heard the hesitation in my voice, and the applause did not rise as high as it did for the other captains. Perhaps their reluctance to respond resulted from trying to figure out what I was saying in a voice that shook, lacking in confidence. And I felt like I was in a moment where who I was as an individual was in limbo, and my cultural identity was momentarily lost. For years after those two distinct high school experiences, I continued to force myself to think exclusively in English. And while I was at home amongst friends, I used this language the most, with a few instances of Sheng and Kiswahili. In spite, I came from a very small town that would easily, be classified as big village. In my own home, my mother and my siblings communicated and spoke to me in Kikamba almost exclusively. And while this was the most natural language to me, I continued to struggle because my mind gravitated towards English all the time. Therefore, there seemed to be constant burdensome processes of translation that were occurring in my mind all the time. And this lady's voice stayed with me. To excel, you have to think in English, exclusively in English. And so I failed to consciously train my mind to think in or process things in my mother tongue. Even so, Kikamba feels natural and full of wonder to me. It connects me to the mundane things that remind me of home, the warmth of conversations with my mother and siblings. And so for the following years, I struggled to articulate anything to them in the language I loved most and contradictorily tried to avoid. So many years later, in yet another distinct moment, everything about all this changed. There had been a lot of internal conflicts arising from everything I faced in relation to my mother tongue. Which is a language I always loved. And I remember an essay that I read recently by Amy Tan, where she gives words to this feeling that I've had for a long time. She says, I am fascinated by language in daily life. I spend great deals of time thinking about the power of language, the way it can evoke an emotion, a visual image, a complex idea, or simple truth. Language is the tool of my trade. While to her, this fascination is with different Englishes she uses, mine is a fascination with my mother tongue, which had increasingly become a distant desire to me. So I began to imagine ways to engage my language, Kikamba, and other African languages. Without the full knowledge of what this would be or mean, I conceptualized a translation project with Jalada Africa, and Jalada is a Pan-African collective I'd worked with since 2014. So the concept of the translation project was simple. I would get one short story written in an African language and have it translated into as many other languages as possible, the main target being other African languages. So in a sense, we were chasing the idea of inter-African language translations in theory and practice. While this brought me closer to my African languages, it did not dispel the internal tussle between English and my mother tongue. And so to celebrate the global significance of this translation project, Jalada organized a panel conversation in Nairobi. We invited Professor Ngugi to be, in conversation. And while I was in conversation with him, he reiterated to me, and in a sense to the audience, the importance of being freed from what he called the English metaphysical empire. So in that instance, it occurred to me that the struggle in my mind was an invasion of my mental universe cultivated since I was a small child. When I was denied to speak my language in primary school, when I was denied access to any material in my mother tongue, when I was told to excel, I must only think, read, and speak English. This was total mental invasion in whose colonial roots had been validated and propagated by post-colonial educational structures. From that moment, I saw I would devote myself to learning my language and its application in speaking, reading, and writing. So the opportunity to do so presented itself in an unexpected way. When my friend, Professor Mukoma Wagugi, shared a tweet online, and this tweet was calling for the urgency of teachers in African languages. So within days, that tweet had thousands of retweets, and I followed these conversations very, very keenly. Conversations that were created around that tweet. And I realized that thousands across the continent, its diaspora, shared this deep-seated desire to learn their own languages. And for me, it was a call to action, not just for us who would facilitate this process, but also for those who wanted to teach and learn these languages. We requested people to sign up and become a part of a global resource for teachers in African languages. And tens of people sent messages expressing their desire to participate. They wanted to be a part of the database, some as teachers and others as students. And this was the beginning of the Etuika African Languages Teachers Database. I would encourage all of us to go on the Etuika website and check out the platform and what it's about in order to kind of get more context about the work. But just to give a brief of what Etuika means, as a Gikuyu word, it means to break, rupture, and revolution. It's a transformation or transition. And with the formation of the platform, we were guided by the belief that centering the writing, teaching, and translation of African languages, we can transform African societies. Therefore, the teaching is at the heart of the work that we do. And I was particularly invested in creating the African Languages Teachers Database because I faced the same challenges many young people like myself have been dealing with when interacting with their own first languages. So while a majority have oral knowledge and sometimes prowess, they do not necessarily possess the tools that would allow them to produce meaningful literary work or scholarly work in these languages. So I believe that if I could be equipped through the assistance of those more experienced than I was in my language, the same could be possible for others. But my colleagues at Etuika and I quickly realized that this was a complicated process that needed many considerations. We needed to understand what constitutes a database, such as what we wanted to create, and how it would function for the maximum benefit of those who are interested in it. And in these thoughts and conversations, we realized that the most basic function that we wanted to start with for the database was to connect those willing to learn to those who have the resources to teach the languages. And this way, we would contribute significantly to supporting the development of African languages. So it did not matter what language it is or where it originates, as long as there was a teacher for it and a student willing to learn the language, we were willing to create or make that connection happen. So the connection between the teacher and the student would then form the first step in creating structures that allowed for effective teaching of African languages. There was, of course, the advantage of online connectivity in the tools such as Zoom, like what we are using now, that makes instruction quite easy. So the hope is to build a global architecture of African language teaching to make resources readily available to African language programs and all kinds of learners from anywhere in the world. But what would such a thing look like? So the first step was to ensure the visibility of the people teaching these languages from the different parts of the world. Those who answered our call made it through the CVIN process. We checked their applications quite carefully, and they were all drawn from different parts of the continent. And they were teaching languages as diverse as, the places where they came from. So we had languages such as Gikuyu in Kenya, we have Kiswahili that's spoken quite widely, we have Leblago in Uganda, we have Zulu in South Africa, we have Mongaka in Cameroon, we have Yoruba in Nigeria, Shona in Zimbabwe, Twi in Ghana, among other languages from both the continent and its diaspora. So a number of those who signed up are actually practicing teachers. They've been doing this work for quite a while. And I will give a few examples of the people that are included on the database. There's one teacher called Waithira Maru, who comes to this with extensive experience in lesson planning, and she has been teaching Gikuyu for a long time in a local primary school, while Naomi Duba Kimonye, who's another teacher from Kenya as well, has over 10-year experience in teaching Kiswahili, and now she is teaching Kimeru. Both these teachers are based in the regions where these languages are spoken on a daily basis, and they bring their expertise in teaching and experiences in the day-to-day use of the language. Among the teachers who have also signed up for the database are those that have been working in the field for so long that they have formed organizations that are devoted to promoting and teaching their respective languages. For example, we have Onyinye Iblegbu, who is a founder, who has founded a company in Nigeria called Noada Igbo Language Services. Through this company, Iblegbu can apply a kind of blended learning to teaching the Igbo language and supplement this with other services in the language. And to demonstrate how intensely her commitment to teaching this language has been for her over the years, she has also gone ahead and created a complete Igbo course on Udemy. So these efforts are driven by a firm commitment to the belief that she can guide anyone, irrespective of their background or heritage, to learn Igbo. Another excellent example is the work of Dr. Juma Muse Juma, who is a PhD holder in computational linguistics. And he founded the Somali Corpus website. You can find that online. And he has extensive experience teaching Somali in different institutions, including Agesa Cultural Center in Somaliland and the Institute of Research, Heritage and Preservation and Development. So for him, the Somali Corpus has enabled him to tag more than 7 million words in Somali. So these two examples demonstrate that some of the teachers have come to this with a wealth of work behind them. I'll give another example of two more teachers. And
then please, you can move to your conclusion. Sorry.
Yeah, as I conclude. Yeah. So before I move to my conclusion, I would like to speak briefly about the importance of creating materials for the learning of, especially for the teachers. And going back to my interest in learning Kikamba, well, I came to this with some oral knowledge of the language, even though in practical sense, I never practiced as much. However, this database also considers that there are many students who wish to learn these languages and will encounter them for the first time. So the language being taught, the student will be dramatically different from their home language. So to effectively teach these target languages, the students and teachers are responsible for adopting processes that enhance their learning. On the one hand, it's expected that students will find ways to immerse themselves in the learning of their target language. And at the same time, the teachers, even though this work is independent of formal instructional centers or school, will curate a structured process for the students to learn. So this calls for the teachers to provide instructions backed by visual and auditory aids and materials for that instruction are really, really important. So the hope for these teachers is that they will create or be able to gain as much materials that they can use to transfer them to the students, because already materials for teaching in African languages are very, very limited. And I could talk, if we had time, I could talk more about what I think about teacher training, why it's important to fund these kinds of things and the benefits that we could gain from such a teacher's database. But I will conclude by saying that the Itwika African Language Database is a part of a dream to transform the African societies by centering the use of African languages in writing, teaching, and translation. And the formation is now born of the need to address some of the issues that we've been dealing with and issues that have historically affected how Africans relate to their languages beyond their use only in oral settings. And because there are not many schools that are teaching African languages to advanced levels, there's often very little happening in the teaching of African languages. And while the database that we've created does not promise to solve all the systematic problems that have existed over the years, I believe it contributes in a small way to ensuring that there's a connection between students who are willing to learn the African languages and the teachers who are been equipped to teach those languages. And thank you.
Thank you, Mayor Kilolo, for this presentation. It's beautiful and instructive presentation, which is partly also your own experience. And I think you will have the opportunity to come back to detail during the discussion. But what I noticed is the fact that the fact you raised about this school, which has their motto in Latin. You see, it is still the case in many of our universities. The university I went to in Burkina, the Université Joseph Kizerbo, the motto is in Latin. University Cheikh Anta Diop of Dhaka is also in Latin. The University of Nairobi in Latin. And there are very few universities in this continent which have their motto in African languages. You have the University of Dar es Salaam, University of Niamey, Abdou Moumouni, and I think Kwame University of Science and Technology in Kumasi. There are very few of them, and most of them are still in Latin. So maybe this is an interesting issue that will bring a discussion among ourselves. Okay. So thank you, thank you very much. And and I will call to the floor the next presenter, Aboubakar Sanogo. Ok, lui, sa communication, son titre est en français, donc je vais le présenter en français. Je ne sais pas, il va parler peut-être en anglais, peut-être en français, je ne sais pas, c'est lui qui verra. Alors, Aboubakar Sanogo est maître de conférence à l'Université de Carleton, au Canada, et conjointement, il enseigne aussi à l'Institute of African Studies et à l'Institute for Comparative Studies in Literature, Art and Culture, dans la même université. Son activité se situe à l'intérieur comme à l'extérieur du milieu académique et cherche à intervenir dans ces deux espaces de manière à les transformer mutuellement. Cela implique la recherche, l'enseignement, la conservation des films, l'élaboration de politiques et le renforcement des institutions. Ces recherches portent aussi sur les cinémas africains et afro-diasporiques. Il nous dira ce que c'est, la théorie, l'histoire et la forme du film documentaire, les cinémas transnationaux et mondiaux, la préservation et la restauration des films, le cinéma colonial, le cinéma ancien et muet, ainsi que les études sur les festivals du cinéma. Alors moi, j'ai connu Aboubakar au festival du cinéma de Ouagadougou, donc pendant le FESPACO, où il est très impliqué. Il est aussi le secrétaire régional pour l'Amérique du Nord de la Fédération panafricaine des cinéastes, FEPACI, qui est la plus grande organisation de cinéastes d'Afrique. Et c'est l'un des meilleurs critiques du cinéma africain à ma connaissance. Alors, le titre de sa communication, c'est « Cinéma africain, langue nationale et production de l'espace public en Afrique ». Alors, Aboubakar, tu es le bienvenu. Si tu veux bien ouvrir ton micro, donc tu as 20 minutes, comme notre jeune frère Kilolo. J'espère que tu vas respecter.
On va essayer.
Merci, bienvenue à toi.
Merci à toi, merci. My presentation will be in English. It's a great pleasure and honor for me to be presenting today on this panel in the presence of such august company. I would like to first thank my dear friend Yoporika Some for inviting me to join Quora and to join, of course, this particularly in a highly stimulating working group. I would, of course, also finally like to thank the founders of Quora itself for really instituting this beautiful infrastructure for the production and dissemination of knowledge about, on, and throughout our continent. I'd like to use the few minutes that I have to have an exchange with you regarding some of the relations between African cinema, African language, and the production of public space in Africa. So I'd like to first situate some of the touchstones of the problematic and then examine a few case studies I don't know if I'll be able to conclude with potential prospect. Let me share my screen with the PowerPoint. So I'll be reading. Hopefully I'll be able to read, work the PowerPoint, and potentially show you some excerpt of film. We'll see how that goes. So let's start with my PowerPoint first. Here. There you go. All right. Okay. So, all right. So situating the problem of African languages in African cinema, it's important to remind the audience very quickly about the ways in which Africa encountered the cinema. We tend to situate the emergence of the cinema in the late 19th century, in particular in the final decade of that century. This is when many inventors were rushing in Europe, that is, and North America, were rushing to create an apparatus that would decompose and recompose movement as part of scientific experiment. It should be noted that, in fact, the movement of Africans were actually used for the analysis of that movement in the process. So we all know, or at least many of us know, that among some of the most prominent figures in the emergence of the moving image in general include people like Thomas Edison and, of course, the Lumiere brothers. Well, the latter, in the process of where are we here? Yes. The latter, in reaction to Thomas Edison, created in late 1884 and early 1895, the 5-kilo portable camera they called the cinematograph, and gave it the capacity not only to record images, but also to project them to the public. In other words, attempting to produce a cinematic public space. Meanwhile, of course, Africa was under the collective assault of many European countries, European countries who, following the infamous Berlin Conference, decided to descend upon the continent to kill, destroy, maim, take over land, population, resources, modes of government, culture, and of course, languages. So we tend to say that cinema came to Africa in the suitcases of colonialism. This means that the first images of Africa in the cinema were, in fact, demeaning images. For example, the people on your right here, who are the Lumiere brothers, for some reason, the sort of design function changed the position of my images, so the Lumiere should be on the left, looking on the right at these people who are swimming. Yeah. Anyway, with demeaning images. So Black Africans, and it's important to know that Black Africans in particular entered the cinema in or at the zoo, either in Paris or in Lyon. So the image that you see to your left here is an image that was shot, sort of 48-second film that was shot in 1896 in the Paris Zoo, where some people, I believe from Senegal and Mali, were brought to be exhibited in that space. So the scenario of the film is essentially having these young Africans jump into the water to look for coins that the Frenchman was throwing into the water. So imagine, so you're throwing coins into the water, you have young African jumping into the water to look for it. So imagine the sort of equivalent of feeding your fish in an aquarium. So you throw the food into the water, and the fish, of course, struggle to find it. That's, if you will, one of the ways in which, of course, they sought to demean African cinematically. But it's not the only one. You should know that they made at least about, okay, just to change my frame here. They made at least about 100 films that related to Africa. So Africa, both south and north of the Sahara. Yeah, very good. So this series of images, for example, were shot in the city of Lyon itself, where they invented the cinematograph. They exhibited Africans. So African women were asked to this. In fact, this is a group of Ghanaians. In fact, so they were brought there in a zoo. So you had people literally behind fences looking at them as if they were animals. And so you have this woman who's sort of asked to produce the difference of a baby by bathing the baby, and people are on the other side trying to see whether a black baby reacts the same way as a white baby, etc., when they're being washed, etc. And of course, sort of the beginning of the production of images about Africa, some of the tropes around Africans in dance and so on. Here, of course, another way of demeaning these kids by having them compete for food, for example, while people on the other side are looking at them as if they were swarming like around food. And of course, around the question of school was very important. So to show that they're being civilized, so there's sort of from regression to progress, so that they're being civilized, of course, they brought a teacher, an English language teacher, of course, and of course they saw the kids learning diligently and therefore going higher in civilization, so to speak. So these are so for almost 65 years, you have this kind of regime of images of Africa, colonial regime of Africa, which often showed African languages as incomprehensible gibberish, the incomprehensible gibberish of warmongering populations who needed to be saved from their atavistic selves. And so now, although Africans got interested in making films or being involved in films as early as the inaugural years of the cinema, indeed, we have many pioneers, amateurs, and professionals from the late 19th century to the end of the colonial era. It was really in the age of decolonization that there was an acceleration and the production of a cadre of people who wished to take up the camera and offer different representations of their population. This is an extremely important period and complex period, but I wish to insist on just one particular axis of it that has implications for the relationship between African languages and African cinema. I would like to link African cinema with the broader decolonization movement, and in fact, the broader intellectual and cultural decolonization movement, one element of which was embodied by what I call the Présence africaine movement. Some of you know a lot about it, which gathered some of the most important intellectuals and artists of the 20th century. You see here, this movement, which was created in Paris under the banner of Cheikh Anta Diop, surrounded by Léopold Senghor and Aimé Césaire, was set out to produce discourse around about the relationship between colonialism and culture and the meaning of decolonization for Africa and indeed African and indeed world culture. Most people know that they held two important congresses in Paris in 1956 and in Rome in 1959, that they were, in fact, a perpetual working group, around the circulation of ideas, and that they invested in the notion that African artists and intellectuals had a role to play and responsibilities in the upcoming decolonial, post-colonial politics. In this context, they set up commissions to meticulously study the various domains of African life and culture and imagine how they might be organized and structured. So here you see, for example, some of the people who attended that famous Congress. The names of many of them have been, in fact, mentioned already. I can't see my screen very well, but if I were to increase it a little bit, I would say somewhere around here you have Cheikh Anta Diop, who's been talked about a lot. You have Léopold Senghor here. You have Frantz Fanon, lost somewhere here, in fact, here. Alioune Diop here. Aimé Césaire somewhere here, etc., etc. Okay. Anyway, so there was a collective intellectual movement to really think these questions through. And so, in particular, the 59 Congress, where am I here? They set up a number of commissions, in fact, to study these various aspects of African language, of African culture. And language, in fact, was one of the important ones here. if I could unshare and reshare my screen a little bit, it might be good for us, in fact, as a working group, to go back to these original documents, because in fact, they mention a lot that we've been discussing over the past month around this question. This, for example, is the resolution from the Linguistics Commission, for example, which, discusses the question of African language. So they call upon young African research to undertake the sustained study of African languages, to look beyond the multiplicity of African languages for a true foundation of their unity, to encourage the natural and desirable evolution toward the regrouping of these languages. So they take into account the fact that the African continent has more than 600 languages, that there are languages of unity across the continent, etc., etc. You have people, languages in all these countries, that an independent Africa should not adopt any European or foreign language as a national language, that preferential African language should be chosen, etc., etc. Some of our debates already, that Swahili possesses an important literature and is spoken in East Africa, Central Africa, Hausa across West Africa, Yoruba in Nigeria, Benin, Bamana and Mandingo, all the way in sort of in West Africa as well, Fulani, Wolof, etc. So they discuss many of these questions. So it might be interesting for us to actually go back and how far we are relative to 1959 today. So to come back to my PowerPoint. Anyway, so alongside the sciences, cinema was also, and of course languages, cinema was also one of the important things that were discussed. So there were African filmmakers at these congresses. They took part in the presentations, and they decided to also participate to create a cinematic front for the emancipation of the continent, alongside the linguistic front, the scientific front, the literary front. Yeah, very good. So in some ways, they set out to make African language one of the battlegrounds for the creation of African cinema and one of its distinctive and identification features. So the battle for cinema, which is itself seen as a language, and the battle for African languages and everything else they represent, so worldviews, mode of thinking, archive, knowledge and feeling. I think you probably can mention other aspects from Cheikh Anta Diop, etc. Would go hand in hand in many ways. So this battle was also at the same time a battle for a new African agora, inflected by the two. So very quickly, one of the most important figures in that context, of course, was this gentleman known as the father. I'm going to reduce a little bit. Known as the father of African cinema, although he was by no means the very first African to make a film. But he has such a discursive power. In other words, there's African cinema before Seven and there's African cinema after Seven. There's no doubt about that. And so I think his symbolic significance as a father, I think, must remain. So he was aware, obviously, of the centrality of African languages. And that awareness came concomitantly with what we can call his eureka moment regarding the cinema as the most important art for him. He often recounts that he made a long trip by foot from Senegal to Congo. And that meant, so by foot, by hitchhiking, etc. So imagine the distance between West Africa, sort of the westernmost state in West Africa and Central Africa, the heart of Central Africa. And so in the process of traveling, of course, he would go from village to village, city to city, village to village. Most of the people he encountered did not speak French or the European languages, but rather African languages. So this obviously, because of course, prior to becoming a filmmaker, he was a writer, he was a novelist, short story writer. And so this made him aware that, of course, African literature in French, he writes that for him, as a writer, so writing African literature in French made him really irrelevant to the people whose voices and experiences he sought to represent, and who couldn't read a word of what he wrote. So this acute consciousness of the need to center African languages at the same time as turning to the moving image, which circulated infinitely more, changed indelibly the course of African cinema. Because in his wake, many people would turn to cinema to express the wealth and depth of African experiences of life on Earth. So we are somewhere around the early 1960s, where of course various uses of African language start taking place within African cinema. So in Mali, for example, we know that, in fact, one of the first institutions of cinema that African states set up were newsreels or actualités in French. Well, in the context of Mali, I'm sure we will find other examples in many other African countries. Modibo Keita, for example, decided that his newsreels would, in effect, be projected in two languages, in French and in Bamana, which is sort of the dominant language in Mali. So the people, when they would go to the movie theaters to see what was happening in the state or the relationship between Mali and the rest of the world, etc., they would have a Bamana voice over that would recount those images. So that's already one of the first starting points. In Senegal, of course, people like Paulin Vieira made a film entitled Singeli in 1964. Semben's own first film, which is this, Boram Sare, was not in French, but he started the practice in part of titling his films in African languages. So here, instead of calling his film The Wagana, he referred to it as Borom Saret in Wolof, that is the man with a wagon or a cart. Right? And so most of the other film would be titled in Wolof as well, or other African languages. So here, for example, is his film in 1968 entitled Mandabi, the Money Order. So in addition to titling the film, from Mandabi, he actually has another shift. So not only giving African, titling his films in African languages, but also titling the credit sequences. Now, as you know, when you go to the cinema, look at African film, most of them have the credits in European languages, right? So here, for example, written and directed by Ousmane Sembène, he had, I don't know how to pronounce it, my Wolof is a bit weak, Bindi Miseni Ousmane Sembène, right? So it's sort of transliteration of Wolof here in Roman languages, and of course, even the writing of his name itself, he changed in the process, right? Very good. And so other titles like Emitai, Hala, Chedo, Kandichara, which is in French, but in fact, much of the language in Kandichara, of course, is of course Africanized uses of colonial languages, etc. So you have Geloa, Fatkine, Molade, etc. Okay. So in doing this, of course, these early efforts, you can imagine, of course, gave many Africans the desire to become filmmakers, because of course it was a sign that they were appropriating something that was seen by many as foreign, as European or Western or mystifying, etc. So one cannot really underestimate the role of African language in giving Africans the feeling that the cinema was also theirs, was their property, and that they could use it as they wished. Since then, African films have been made constantly in African languages. They circulate across Africa, across the world. They contribute to exporting African languages worldwide through film festivals, theatrical screening, DVDs, Blu-rays, streaming platform. You all know about Netflix's project on Africa, etc., etc. So that's important to keep in mind. In the diaspora as well, they help circulate and preserve the sense of African identity, of disseminating the love for African languages, and the desire and possibility to learn and teach them. Now, I wanted to spend a bit of the how much do I have here, please? The remaining time.
So go to your conclusion too.
No, you must be kidding.
You have eaten your 20 minutes.
No kidding. No kidding.
So try to sum up there. Yeah.
Okay, so instead of just summarizing, I'm just gonna just point to some particular examples, yeah? So African filmmakers have used African languages in a multiplicity of ways throughout the film production process, from conception to consumption. So these uses have included the use, as I said, of title, credit sequences, dialogues, acting, narrative structures, the foregrounding of speech, the production of a visual vocabulary concepts, multilingualism, hierarchies between languages, subtitling, dubbing, music, soundtrack, theme songs, and many, many, many other ways. And so I took the example of Usman Semben, but I could have taken also other people like Medhondo, for example. If you look at Medhondo's first feature film, Suleyo, in fact, he deploys languages to understand, in fact, explain the mechanism, processes through which, of course, African languages were suppressed, and how this suppression of African language, therefore African culture, became one of the mechanisms through which Africans were, in fact, turned into colonial subjects, as it were. He imports, for example, structures of orality into the cinema. He critiques, for example, the concept of francophonie as a strategy for the neo-colonial pact. He validates the Creole languages, and of course, has to resort to other forms of languages in order to make his film Sarawunya, which was intended to be made in Niger, but had to be retranslated to be made in Burkina Faso. So one other, I think Yoporeka would probably like, is of course that in the process of trying to represent African cosmogony, so African writing forms were also interpolated. And when you look at the ways in which the filmmakers do that, in fact, they evoke the idea, of course, of the ideogram that Eisenstein evokes as well when he thinks about the notion of montage. And that's really important. So here, for example, Suleiman Cissé, who made the film Yela, at the beginning of the film, he tries to explain how, in fact, in Bamana cosmogony, in fact, heat combined with something else. Here, they didn't really give this the translation. So those who are experts could help me out here. So make fire, but you see how here it's the term that I use is just heat, so ngonia, and here ta, which is fire. So you have the words that are used separately. So ngonia, ta. So heat, fire, or heat or makes fire. So in other words, sentences are produced or are deduced as a result of the putting in relationship with each other of two concepts simply, or two words or two elements in this particular case. Yeah. So that, in fact, is also the way in which montage has been defined in cinema, the collision of images, of diametrically opposing images, which would produce a third idea. And of course, it was a language through which issues of access to esoteric knowledge could be done. We can think of languages, of course, as partaking of the birth of a national cinema. I think there are beautiful examples in Burkina, for example. I have a testimony here by Ferid Bougir, who recounts watching the first Burkinabe language in Morée, for example, and how he saw an entire people recuperate that film because they felt that it belonged to them. We can finally take, for example, I think in the context of the cinema of Abdelrahman Sissako, which is a really, really very interesting case study of multilingualism in African cinema in most of his films, but in fact, Timbuktu is one of them. Timbuktu being, of course, a film about the advent of jihadism in this northern part of Mali and how they took over the culture and now impose a very strict Islamist Sharia law on the people, forbidding music, forbidding soccer and other things. And so he does a beautiful dance or choreography of multiple languages, being in fact in relationship with each other, creating a space of survival, not necessarily conviviality, but of survival, of living together in spite of everything. So you have Arabic, you have English, you have French, you have Sarai, you have Tamashek, etc. It's really, I mean, I have examples. If time was on my slide, I would have showed it to you. I would like to finish, of course, with the fact that, as you know, Nollywood is now one of the biggest representatives of African cinema. And it was noted, for example, in the early 2000s that its northern version, which was Kannywood, and therefore which short films in Hausa. Then when this film would circulate in Hausa-speaking countries, neighboring countries like Niger, for example, by virtue of overconsumption of Nollywood films, the Hausa speakers of Niger started to actually take the Nigerian Hausa accent as a result of being exposed to the melodrama, etc., that Nollywood would produce. So in other words, there's infinitely multiple ways in which we can think about this question. To conclude simply that, of course, the question of African language offers this multiple potential for African cinema, for the production of Pan-African citizenship, etc., etc. I leave it there. Thank you.
So thank you, Abubakar, for your presentation. Okay, thank you very much for your presentation and for the relation that you have drawn between cinema and the fight for the battle for decolonization, cinema and the battle for the African languages, because it is not the way we usually see cinema. And even I think there is a link between what you said and what Mwalimu, the next presenter, will discuss. And you show two examples of Semben's title, film's title. Even when he borrowed a word from French, these two films you talk about, Mandabi and Borom Saret. So he adapted to the African languages. So this is wonderful. Now, and I think we'll come back during the discussion to all these points. Now I will call to the floor Professor Romenga Ntali Osotsi, who is a professor and academic leader at the Institute of General Studies at Dedan Kimathi University of Technology here in Kenya. His research interests focus on ancient Black knowledge, and it linked to the present-day African literature and languages, the theory of African literature, oral literature, classical written African literature, and classical written Kiswahili literature. So he has published many publications in Kiswahili language that include Falme Kufu na Waganga Wake, Falme Kufu na Waganga Wake, which is King Kufu and he is a magician. Also Aditi Sanat, Mkumoja wa Kemet. This is the story of Sinwe or Sanat, an official of Kemet. And he has translated the Mande Charter, Azimiola Mande. And the title of his communication today is The Centrality of Kingozi Kiswahili in the Reclamation and Restoration of African Memory. Now, Mwalimu, maybe you will explain, you will clear for us the use of these two words, Kingozi and Kiswahili, if they are different things or a different word for the same thing. So you are welcome for
Definitely.
your 20 minutes.
Thank you. And just a technicality, how do I share my screen? Or is the PowerPoint going to be run from the other side? I would like to share my PowerPoint, please.
I think you can do it. You
Yes.
go to you go to the right side of your screen.
Yes.
Yeah, you will get 3 points. So you click on them,
there's a
and then you
screen.
will have the sharing of your screen, I think.
There you go.
Yeah. So while Mwalimu is uploading his presentation, I just want to remind our audience that we will get the fourth and last presentation by Waka Boris Diop, and then we will open the session of question and answer and also discussion at the end. So thank you. So you can write down your different questions and then come with them during the special session.
Mwalim, if you don't mind, we can run it from that side,
okay.
So that I don't waste time, and we continue.
Okay,
I'll just keep on asking to move the slide and so on.
Okay, okay, ok.
Okay.
Donc, est-ce que la régie peut afficher la présentation, le PowerPoint de professeur Osotsi, s'il vous plaît?
Is it showing now?
Let me see. I think it is coming. Not yet, but okay, good. It is good, Mwalimu. You can go.
That is good. Yes,
Yeah.
This is my topic for today: the centrality of Kingozi Kiswahili in the reclamation and restoration of African memory. And what I want to do in this case is actually to address the whole issue of Kiswahili language in the context of what the seminar required, which is looking at African languages in the public sphere, their participation in the public sphere. The only thing that I did was to expand it so that it is not in the African sphere alone, but in the world sphere, because when we talk about the African sphere, just about everybody now can access it. Eastern peoples, Western peoples, and so on. And a lot of the comments that I'm going to make today are actually by people from outside Africa who participate in our space, telling us what we are supposed to be and what we are not supposed to be. So, first of all, with your permission, I just want to explore a little what circulation means. To be able to circulate is to have power derived from economic, technological, political, cultural sources, etc. I want to include here also judicial power, the ability to judge and to stand there authoritatively and pass the laws, make sure that the laws that were passed by, say, for example, Parliament are enforced. It's very interesting and very necessary to understand this. Now, when it comes to looking at our languages, their ability or inability to circulate depends very much on how much power they can access. This power enables the language, if it has the language, it enables that language to name everything in the universe. So, for example, if it is a language that has dominion, to use that old phrase, it has dominion over a certain people, that language is going, of course, to name, it is going to dictate, it is going to decide who is a human being and who is not a human being, things like that. So, and the other important thing to keep in mind is that if someone else comes with a different type of knowledge, this language that has power, that is circulating in the public sphere, that language has the right to contradict that person. So, who are you people? We are Yorubas, we are Luyas, we are whatever. No, from now on, you are Africans. That is what we are going to call you. There's a certain power that is imbued in this ability to circulate that this language exercises. So if you look at what English does in Africa, or what French does in Africa, Portuguese, and so on, they tell us how to name not only ourselves, but the things that we interact with. The manifestation of circulation, you see it by, first of all, self-definition, those languages that do a lot of circulation in Africa, in our public sphere, they define themselves. We don't do it, but they define themselves as modern languages. And they, of course, immediately get into the driving seat where they control policy, law, legislation, education. People will sit down and hold big conferences discussing as to whether we can discuss sciences in an African language. And of course, I'm sorry to say, some of us still are at that stage where we think that African languages will never be able to discuss a science. But the same African languages perhaps are able to discuss witchcraft and things like that. This type of this is your sphere because we tell you we are the ones who are circulating there. We are the modern languages. This is what a language with power does to, of course, the other languages. And in our case, on the continent, our languages, all African languages, are designated as languages without power, languages that are still waiting to catch up with the rest of the so-called advanced world and so on. So you look at the state of an African language today, and of course, if you ask yourself, where in Africa is an African language circulating in a public sphere, the only time we enjoyed some kind of recognition was during Mwalimu Nyerere's time, when we really saw Kiswahili come up and do a lot of wonderful things, showing us how you can run an entire state using an African language, from the law, the education, and so on, all these different spheres, so that the Tanzanian peoples began now having a completely different type of identity from, say, their immediate neighbors where I come from, the Kenyan peoples, who are still very much stuck on English when it comes to dealing with, in quotes, serious issues. But when it was you wanted to discuss non-serious things, then you talked of African languages and so on. Let's not forget also the Arabic language in the north. We need to come up to some kind of understanding about this particular language. Signs that a language is not circulating, does not have control over its own public sphere, this one is immediately recognizable. It has a little economic power. It is not even respected in its own societies. It is not a carrier of truth about itself and its people. Who told you this? If you say it in Kiswahili or you say it in your mother tongue, it is dismissed. But if you say it in English or French or some obscure European language, that one will be immediately acceptable as being the language. And even if its recognized name is not of its own making, a lot of African names for our places, official recognized names for our places, are actually not the names that we invented themselves. They are distortions of what Europeans could not pronounce when they came to Africa and they just dumped. So for example, Kenya is not a word that was invented by Africans of this part of the world. Mount Kenya is not a name for that particular mountain that we know of, and so on. These are common examples, I think, that go all over the whole continent. And then usually there's also some kind of sneering, some kind of smirking when you look at these African languages, that they are considered languages for punishment. If you want to punish a kid in school because he's not speaking a civilized language, you catch him, of course, speaking an African language, and then you go ahead and punish him. So the marginalization of this language, this is something that we have discussed before, but it is something, and even my previous presenters today, they have also mentioned this. Even after so many years of independence, African languages are still marginalized. They are still pushed away from the center. And the question is, who does this marginalization? Don't forget, as the earlier presenter, Kilolo, mentioned, the tragedy of teaching an African child in a non-African language and starting the whole alienation process right from the time when this child is 2-3 years old and he or she goes into nursery school throughout the rest of their life. It's really amazing how Africans, we have been able to survive this cultural trauma, if we can put it that way. But this mistake has a certain tenacity. It continues to remain powerful in our continent. Hence, for example, the conference today, it is actually a response to why is it that we still continue to do things in a language that is not our own. And there are many excuses for this. Immediately you get people talking about, oh, we are using languages, world languages, we are using modern languages, we are using languages that will help us, that will assist us to develop very fast. So if we use an African language, we'll be held back. Some of the Tanzanian peoples today, they now talk about how they were held back economically during Mwalimu Nyerere's time because they were using Kiswahili. So we need to do what Kenya has done. We need to do what Uganda has done. That type of tragedy is something that we see there. But the truth of the matter is that there's a lack of will, lack of especially political will that arises from what I would just roughly term as greed and laziness. And the consequences of this greed and laziness is stagnation in our educational system, institutions, perpetuation of a dependency mindset, which awaits solutions to all problems in Africa. Is there a problem in education in Kenya, for example? Oh yes, let's call a conference. Let's call put together a panel of experts, and these experts should all come from outside Africa. They should never be part of the African issue. Right now in Kenya, we are undergoing a kind of a reassessment again of what education means to our society. And one of the big questions that is not being asked is what language shall we use? It seems as if we are all tragically agreed that we shall continue to use the English language. And then positive consequences of greed and laziness, we have little innovation in many aspects of our lives and a perpetuation of the distortion of memory of ourselves. These are some of the things that I would like to point out. But when we look at Cheikh Anta's message to us so many years later, I'll just paraphrase it here, that the duty of an African scholar, people engaged in the generation of knowledges, whether this scholar be an artist or a scientist, is to help extend a memory of ourselves. Amongst so many of the things that we are doing, whether you are in the sciences or in the arts, we need to help extend a memory of ourselves beyond what we know of ourselves in the here and now. And this will be of great consequence, not just to Black people, but to humanity as a whole. Let me point out, as our earlier in the first conference that we had, that people pointed out, the presenters pointed out that Africa has very many languages. By estimation, some people say that half of the world's languages are in Africa. In other words, we have a unique way, in fact, a unique chance to be able to transform the world's knowledge of itself about languages. And we should not wait for the Swedes or the Japanese or whoever to come up and tell us about language, because they don't confront the problems or the research challenges about language the way we of course do. Let's not forget also that he or she who controls the public space has power to control how the story is told, the old story about the lion and the hunter. Whose story are we telling? Africans, we need to begin turning into the lions that tell our stories. We need to change the whole discourse on language and the study of language in Africa by participating, by centralizing, of course, our languages. What public space are we referring to? The library in its widest sense. Google is a library, and I've noticed my students in Dedan Kimathi University, many of them, Google it, go to Google. When you go to Google, you find that some of the things that are said about Africa are a bit of a disaster. They perpetuate wrong ideas about ourselves. So, the story of the lion. If the lion were to tell the story about the hunt, what would we say? Using Kingozi Kiswahili as an illustration of how an African language, this language of Eastern Africa, despite its amazing feats of survival, Kiswahili has a whole long tradition of excellent writing, and you hear people talk about modern African literature began in such and such a time. We leave out a whole history of great writings. For example, in 1962, when writers met in Kampala and they were talking about how do we develop literature in Africa, and they were talking about development of African literature, there was a huge debate on whether we should use English or modern languages that were our colonial masters, but there was very little discussion on Kiswahili and its a great tradition, great writers and so on. These are some of the things that we need to talk about. Kiswahili itself still struggles. This is amazing. It still struggles to assert its right to correctly identify itself. A lot of people still refer to, of course, Kiswahili as Kiswahili, but we know very well that Kiswahili, its root meaning is from Arabic. These Arab adventurers, when they passed by, they say the people of the coast, this is the language of the people of the coast. So if they had gone to California, they would have said, this is the language of the people of the coast. And Kiswahili would have been the language of the people of California, or the people of the coast of Japan, or the people of the coast of Sweden, or somewhere like that. It just accidentally happened to be that this is where they came, and that's how we got this name. But did we have a name? Did the so-called Waswahili today, did they have a name for themselves? And yes, Sheikh Nabhani, who is a scholar both in the indigenous knowledge and in Western style knowledge, came up and reiterated this statement that Kiswahili, that is a name given to us by the Arabs, but we ourselves, we call it Kingozi. Kingozi is just a name, Kiswahili is just a name given to us by Arabs, but the real name is Kingozi, and the Wangozi people themselves. This is who they are. They are not Waswahili. They are Wangozi. But if you go into a lot of writings on Kiswahili and its origins, many of the people who write on Kiswahili, this is not the area they emphasize. They emphasize more of how the Arabs came and gave us an identity. The historical linguistic explorations of this name gives us the following. And this is where studying the ancient Egyptian links to the rest of African languages, excellent work done by Cheikh Anta Diop, and of course the great Theophilo Benga. This study of those links gives us the following, that the meaning of Ngozi is clearly a cognac. It is clearly related to certain words which I shall point out in Medu, the ancient Egyptian language. The word itself is ngati, or Ngoti, or from the ancient language, from the ancient Egyptian language. And it's usually written NXHT, or if you use this transliteration, you write it that way, you write it in this manner. But the possible pronunciation, and this is important, the possible pronunciation of this is either Ngoti, Ngosi, or Ngori, or whichever variations there may be. The meaning, the difference, notice the Arab meaning for Kiswahili is people of the coast. Our meaning for the same language is that these are to be a Ngoti or a Ngosi, or to be related in any way to this particular pronunciation is to be strong, victorious, to be stiff, hard, obdurate. I'm using the ancient Egyptian language. If you look online, you'll see Mark Vigas has a useful a PDF that you can use. Still continuing in the meaning of Ngoti is a strong, victorious, a stiff, a strong man, a protector, protection, powerful. And then when you go with these meanings, Ngosi, Ngozi, this word now begins to expand. You find that it is actually a word that goes all the way to Southern Africa, and Shaka is the Nkosi, or the Nkosi of the Amazulu people, and so on. It is likely that it's not just the Zulu peoples, the Nguni peoples, but it is likely to be a word that has spread in very many parts of Eastern and Southern Africa. I'm still going with the meanings, and it doesn't change. And this is from Middle Egyptian. It's a strong man. Ngosi is a strong man, is a protector, and he's a champion. This is the ancient meaning for it. In other words, what Cheikh Anta Diop's studies and Obenga studies tell us about the necessity to link up African languages with their ancient past, it comes out clearly, because then it helps us see that what we now call Kiswahili is not Kiswahili actually. The people themselves are Wangozi, and they know that they are called Waswahili by other peoples, but this was their original language, their original name for their language and themselves, and that this name links them all the way to their ancient past. If you go to our dictionary in Kiswahili, and there are many dictionaries, all of them made by foreigners, you'll not find this connection, this link between Ngozi as what the Waswahilis call themselves, and how it links up to the ancient Egyptian, and how this word also shows very clearly the links between the peoples in Eastern Africa and, of course, Southern Africa and Central Africa, and so on. These are just examples of the words in different communities, Western Kenya, Southern Africa, and so on, Ngosi, Nkosi, and so on. The Arab meanings, I've already discussed that. But if you look at our discussion about marginalization, the indigenous knowledge, the indigenous scholars in Kiswahili are marginalized, and they are preferred to those who would come up and say Arabic and so on are at the center of defining who these African peoples are supposed to be. Now, if we can imagine a moment when we restore African languages, including Kiswahili, to the center of our public sphere, we then begin to restore some of the missing parts of our past, and we should be able to realize that the myths spread during colonial times that Kiswahili is an Arabic language. Kiswahili is a dominantly Arabic language. Kiswahili has borrowed everything from Arabic. All these myths, all these stories are put to rest, and then we begin to recognize that for us to understand ourselves, we have to carry out this mission using our languages. We cannot begin to talk about the necessity of centering our languages in the public sphere if we use foreign languages, if we continue to use foreign languages. So is it Kingozi or Kiswahili? The African peoples ourselves will have to come together and decide what we should call our languages. But in the meantime, those of us who are requested to make a presentation on this, we come up with this uncomfortable, clumsy Kingozi Kiswahili. But it really should be just a Kingozi. That's what the language is, and that's how the people have understood themselves from the ancient times, thousands of years, into the present. Long before Arabic came into existence, Kingozi was there in a different form. Now, here I became tempted to see how to link up words and rituals in Eastern African languages to that ancient past, so that we can see just what a great history we have and why it is necessary to revive our languages and use our languages, no matter how seemingly weak they may be. In the old language, we talk about the crown, the white crown of Upper Egypt, and this one, it can be Kaj or Kaj and so on. We'll have to work on the pronunciation, but this was the crown, that white crown. Please keep it in mind. It's the crown of Upper Egypt, and Upper Egypt was called Shimo or Shuma or Shima from that translation literation. If you go to the Waswahili peoples in Kingozi or Kiswahili, if we prefer, Sima. Sima, we call ugali Sima. It's a type of food. You can recognize it immediately. There's a Sima, and the Sima has certain rituals. You eat it together with those who are close to you. So you have a big mountain of Sima, and people sit around it and so on. The same Sima, keep the white crown in mind and its shape. The Sima reproduces that white crown as we go right across the entire Eastern, Central, and Southern Africa, a common food that we all eat, making it fairly common. But there are certain beliefs associated with eating this fairly common food. Not only do you eat it with your bare hands, but you don't hack at it the way this modern advertisement is doing. You don't hack at it with a sharp object, and definitely no knife and fork, because you are eating a representation of a crown of a section of our ancient past when we were independent. You don't do this type of terrible things to the crown of your land. You don't cut it up and chop it up in this manner. You use your hands. You talk to food with respect. Look at, in fact, if it can permit me, you go back again to the past a little and you ask yourself, who had this very violent idea of destroying the white crown on this king's head, and who usually cuts ugali with this type of knife? So the rituals associated with Sima or Ruobsuma, you don't cut it with a knife. And if you serve ugali or Sima, if you serve it to the people and as you're serving it, it breaks into pieces. My grandmother told me that this is a sign that someone is likely to die in that family. You don't serve that type of food. Compare that with what we see of this our land and what has happened to our land ever since we got people with the sharp knives to come and chop up what our land what our land was. They chop it up. They serve it so that in bits and pieces, so that they can chew us more easily. This is just places where Sima is eaten. You go to Zambia, you go to Malawi, of course, Kenya, Tanzania, Uganda, borders of Uganda. I do believe it's also eaten even in Cameroon, but I'm on safer ground here. Anyway, that is one of those foods which have become symbolic of what unites us. And even up to today, certain ways of relating to that food determine whether we are far away or close to our ancient ideas, something that perhaps we might need to explore. Not just that one, but so many other rituals. As we don't have time here to go into that, but we shall explore it hopefully at some later point. I just decided to run through with some of the words that are common to Kiswahili that originally can be seen in our ancient language, the Middle Egyptian, and the words that were borrowed by Arabic in order to enrich themselves, but which dictionaries these days claim are their own. Mennefer was the name of our ancient city of Memphis. They call it Memphis now. But if you go into Kiswahili, the word manufaa, something of value, still exists. And then Vajitu, you have Baraka, you have Heri. Nakutakia kila la heri. I wish you all the best of luck. Heri is, of course, our ancient god, Horus, who still manifests himself in the language in this manner. In Turkey, one of the slightly better dictionaries in Kiswahili, it talks of Heri, Horus. I wish Horus for you. I wish tranquility, happiness, advantage, and so on. Mtu wa heri, for a strong person, a happy, enviable person, and so on. So sana, the word for art, is people claim it's an Arabic word. No, it is an ancient Egyptian word which is still found in our language, Kiswahili, sana, or hesabu, a word for mathematics, is not Arabic, it's ours. Bata, a word for bat, a duck, or merikebu, which is a word for the ship. This was actually a word that stood for a chariot in our ancient language. The Arabs took it and put it on a ship because they lacked words. And then the word comes back again into a Kiswahili now to stand for that. So there are many of these words. Ng'ombe, for example, a word for cow. Amu, the word for Asiatics. Watu wa Lamu, amu. This there. But in these examples, I would like just to finish with the word siati. It has become siasa in Kiswahili today, and siasa, which is translated as politics, in the old language, it actually meant a cheat, a crook, a fraudster, and so on. So the old people perhaps knew what politicians are. They are cheats and crooks and fraudsters, those people who take into practicing Kiswahili. And then, of course, names of our land. Names of our land, we had...
you will try to conclude after
okay,
the name
I'm
of
concluding.
our land.
I'm finishing.
Thank you.
We had our land is not Africa. That one was given to us by foreigners. But we have... at least 5 different names. I just put here these 2 names. The 2 lands, for example, Tawi, which is Matawi in Kiswahili. Tamri can be Samli in Kiswahili, meaning Nchipendwa, and of course the very well-known Kemit. These are some of the words and the rituals that bring us together. All the above information to conclude, all the above information on Kingozi or Kiswahili and its links to our ancient past does not circulate in the public sphere of our societies because it is retained in our marginalized languages. And until our marginalized languages are empowered to begin now talking authoritatively about who we are, we shall miss out on some of this important knowledge. I would like us to look at the way, for example, we view the African continent this way, and this is just a gift that we put together, but we don't have time to play it. It shows that if you are going to change Africa from this to this type of land, which was the correct perspective of that our ancient peoples had of ourselves. If you are going to change that, it has to be done by black hands. It is the black hands that will have to get hold of our misnamed continent and transform it into our beloved land, as the ancestors would say. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I apologize for perhaps having taken too much time. We shall
No
end.
problem. Okay, thank you, Mwalimu. Asante sana. And this is very interesting to connect this Kingozi with the ancient language. And because you mentioned the dictionary Tuki, and when I got the chance to learn Kiswahili, there are some words like the one you point out, Hesabu in particular, which they will give the origin of this word in the Kiswahili dictionary, referring it as with the letter Ka, meaning it came from Kiarabu, Arabic.
Yes.
No. So this is, and there are other words that you mentioned. But we will come back to all these questions during the discussion. Now, let me call to the floor our last speaker, Boubacar Boris Diop. Je ne sais pas si la régie peut nous passer juste une petite présentation de Boris Diop. C'est une vidéo qui dure à peine 2 minutes. Si cela est possible, vous me dites. Et ensuite, je vais dire encore 2 mots sur lui avant qu'il ne fasse sa présentation. Je ne l'ai pas consulté pour cette forme de présentation. J'espère qu'il ne m'en voudra pas.
Non, je sais pas c'est quoi.
Donc, si la régie peut nous passer, passer juste cet élément avant que tu viennes. S'il vous plaît. Alors, ça vient. Allons-y. S'il vous plaît, la régie, on n'a pas le son. Je croyais que c'était de mon côté seulement, mais est-ce que vous pouvez régler ce problème? S'il vous plaît.
lu toll ci fukki yu nit yow nga ne fi nga jaar yëpp xaw ma communiste nga xaw ma lii nga prof de philo te yëgoo ci dara alors que bu accident de train bu ndaw amee Paris
On n'a toujours pas le son. Si vous pouvez nous mettre que le son, à la limite, sans l'image, ça pourrait aller puisque c'est sous-titré.
lu mu si joué waaw joué na ci xam nga soo ko waxee nit ñi yenn saa yi damay nekk bitim réew ñu may laaj lu tax nga jékki-jékki di bind ci wolof di nga joxe yu bëri di nga ne voilà ci keppaaru Cheikh Anta Diop laa màggee di nga ne dama dem ba sës ci kàllaama Molière dama dem ba yëg ne li ma ciy bugg wax mënutuma ko wax te tamit xam nga bu ñu waxantee dëgg bindkat bi.
Ok, merci beaucoup. Voilà, en fait, ce que je voulais, le passage sur lequel je voulais introduire Boris, bon, il y a un problème technique, c'est donc il parle de ce livre, Murambi, le livre des ossements, et de la façon dont il a été au Rwanda et ce qu'il a appris à ce moment-là, des événements qui se sont produits là-bas en 94. Et à un moment donné, il dit qu'il a pris conscience à ce moment que l'intellectuel africain ne vaut rien. Voilà. Je voulais savoir aussi, en présentant ça, si cette question-là pouvait être reliée à la question de la langue aussi. L'intellectuel africain qui, comme Yoporika, écrit dans une langue que sa propre mère ne comprend pas. Voilà, c'est ça le sujet. Donc, je voulais introduire notre frère par ça et aussi le féliciter. Il vient de recevoir le prix Neustadt, c'est tout frais. C'est l'équivalent du prix Nobel des lecteurs. Et donc, nous sommes très heureux et très fiers au sein de ce groupe et au-delà de cette récompense. Je vais aussi signaler quelques écrits de Boris qui sont en langue, en français, bon, je vais passer, mais qui sont en langue Wolof, hein, Domigolo en 2003, Bamelo Koch Barma en 2017 et Malanum Lendem en cette année 2022. Je signale aussi que Murambi, le livre des ossements, vient d'être traduit par notre collègue Jane Obuchi en Kiswahili. Le titre c'est Murambi Kitabusha Mifupa, et aussi dans la langue maternelle de Jane Obuchi, qui est le Kegusi, et qui est Murambi Egetabu Kiamagao. Donc, ce livre est traduit en Kiswahili et dans une autre langue du Kenya, le Kegusi. Voilà. Ce qui est quand même très encourageant pour la problématique des langues nationales. Alors, le titre de sa communication, c'est en anglais. Alors, je ne sais pas si tu vas parler en français ou en anglais, mais le titre, c'est Ngugi wa Thiong'o, The Passion for Authenticity. Donc, je te laisse la parole pour clôturer cette session. Merci à toi.
Merci Yopo. Mais peut-être que Murambi n'a pas été traduit en Swahili, mais en Kingozi.
En Kingozi, c'est cela même. Je crois que vous avez dit.
Non, je dis ça parce que très franchement,
oui,
j'ai été très, très impressionné par la présentation là, qui vient de... Oui, j'ai été très, très impressionné. Merci beaucoup. Hein. Voilà.
Tu ne m'en veux donc pas.
Oui, mais on apprend beaucoup dans ces rencontres-là. Pour moi, le Kiswahili, c'était évident. Hein, voilà. Et j'étais très fier d'en parler comme de la langue africaine par excellence et découvrir comme ça qu'en réalité, c'est juste une invention des Arabes, en tout cas le nom. Quand même, voilà, ça remue un peu et c'est très intéressant. Cela dit, bonjour ou bon après-midi selon les endroits où l'on se trouve. Moi, je suis à peine 10 heures du matin. En fait, oui, le titre, c'est Ngugi wa Thiong'o, voilà, sa passion pour l'authenticité. Parce que le combat des langues nationales, nous le savons tous, ce n'est pas autre chose que la quête de l'authenticité pour un écrivain. Parler, écrire au plus près de soi-même et de son peuple. Il s'agira de Ngugi, mais j'ai choisi ici de le comparer à un autre écrivain qui mène le même combat, Cheikh Aliou, francophone, sénégalais, et j'essaie de montrer que lorsque deux auteurs africains se plaignent, être obligés d'utiliser les langues coloniales, au fond, il y a des différences liées à l'histoire, à l'héritage colonial qu'il faut qu'il faut pointer, qu'il faut désigner du doigt. Et c'est pourquoi j'ai choisi Cheikh Anta toute sa vie. Cheikh Anta est passé du français au wolof, comme Ngugi est passé de l'anglais au kikuyu. Alors, en fait, c'est un exercice auquel je suis un peu habitué. J'ai déjà consacré des textes à Mongo Betty, dans l'Afrique au-delà du miroir, Africa Beyond the Mirror, à Sebel Ousmane, à Djibril Diop Mambéty, évidemment à Cheikh Anta Diop, Senghor, etc. Voilà, ce sont des portraits que je fais, mais vous aurez remarqué que tous les noms que je viens de citer, c'est des noms d'auteurs francophones. Et ce qui est intéressant avec Ngugi, pour moi, c'est que c'est pratiquement l'auteur anglophone, entre guillemets, qui a eu le plus d'influence parmi les élites littéraires et intellectuelles francophones. Vraiment, et j'aimerais montrer en quoi, voilà, nous, par exemple, dans ma génération, nous connaissions le nom de Ngugi bien avant d'avoir lu ses livres. Parce que, voilà, c'est un écrivain engagé, un peu comme Aimé Césaire, comme Sembène, comme Mongo Betty. Et puis, je crois que de tous ces auteurs que je viens de citer, il était le plus proche de la philosophie marxiste qui, à l'époque, nous servait de canon. Voilà, nous parlions tout le temps de Ngugi comme d'une personne qui nous était proche. Il faut d'ailleurs dire que certains de mes amis à Paris, regroupés autour d'une revue qui s'appelait Tribune Jonction, plutôt Jonction Tribune africaine, eh bien, ils avaient invité Ngugi à Paris et ils lui avaient dit, ben voilà, parle-nous de littérature, de langage et de politique en Afrique. Ngugi s'était exécuté. Moi, je n'étais pas là-bas. Je n'ai jamais étudié en France, donc j'ai eu quand même la chance d'écouter l'enregistrement, et c'était dans une grande atmosphère de complicité entre Ngugi et CKD. Il faut dire aussi que le Festival mondial des arts nègres, on l'oublie souvent, avait distingué Ngugi, qui était bien jeune à l'époque. Il n'avait pas encore 30 ans, il avait 28 ans très précisément, et voilà. Donc, il y a ce rapport-là, et le fait qu'on vient de le traduire en français, voilà, c'est que le lien avec le monde francophone est extrêmement fort et extrêmement important. Mais en fait, Ngugi n'était pas à l'époque vraiment le seul auteur africain ou non d'ailleurs, qui avait de l'importance pour ma génération. Nous étions dans un combat, voilà, pour les damnés de la terre, libérer le prolétariat de ses chaînes, etc. Mais en fait, la raison pour laquelle Ngugi est aussi important pour nous, était aussi important pour nous, il le reste, s'il est encore vivant, c'est que il se focalisait sur la question des langues. La focalisation de Ngugi sur la question des langues en faisait pour nous une espèce de modèle intellectuel, quelqu'un à suivre, quelqu'un à écouter. Et quand je parle de notre génération, je parle évidemment aussi bien des Camerounais, des Congolais, des Sénégalais, voilà. Les francophones, parce que c'est à ce monde-là que j'appartiens et c'est ce monde-là que je connais. Passion pour l'authenticité, au fond, ça revient juste à ce que dit quelqu'un comme le Sud-Africain John Coetzee, dans son livre intitulé Elisabeth Costello, il fait dire à son personnage, une écrivaine australienne imaginaire du nom d'Elisabeth Costello, qui dit à son interlocuteur, un écrivain nigérian, à vrai dire un peu farfelu, hein, cet écrivain nigérian du nom d'Emmanuel Edougou, il dit, mais vous savez, vous les écrivains africains, au fond, vous êtes mis dans une situation impossible, intenable, parce qu'au lieu de vous exprimer avec authenticité, tout ce que vous savez faire, c'est interpréter le monde à l'intention des étrangers. Dire aux autres, voici ce que l'Afrique est. Chaque fois que vous écrivez, dit-il, vous sentez le souffle de ces lecteurs étrangers qui se penchent par-dessus votre épaule et qui lisent votre texte dans le silence de la nuit. Finalement, vous ne pouvez pas ne pas être des écrivains maladroits dans de telles conditions. Vous ne pouvez pas exprimer un univers psychique, sociologique, dans toute sa profondeur, quand vous êtes seulement des interprètes. Au fond, Ngugi avait déjà dit ça. Hein? Ngugi, lorsqu'il dit dans Decoding the Mind, ce que je veux, c'est faire pour ma langue maternelle, le kikuyu, ce que Tolstoï a fait pour le russe, ce que Chaucer a fait pour l'anglais ou Shakespeare. Voilà. C'est vraiment pour ça que il faut parler de quête d'authenticité. Cela veut dire que, en fait, au fond, nous avons eu des générations de pères fondateurs, des combattants tout à fait indomptables. Il suffit de les nommer pour que vraiment des images d'hommes politiques intègres, énergiques, amoureux de leur pays, de leur patrie et de l'Afrique, mais vraiment de façon extrêmement forte. Voilà, c'est des noms, quoi. C'est Lumumba, c'est Nkrumah, c'est Mandela, Nyerere, Nasser, Mohamed Boudiaf, Modibo Keïta, Ahmed Ben Bella, Sékou Touré, Cabral, Agostino Neto, et bon, plus récemment, des hommes politiques, des hommes d'État comme Edouard de Mondlane, Thomas Sankara ou Jerry Rawlings. C'était des gens, mais vraiment, comme je viens de le dire, des esprits puissants, amoureux du continent, de leur pays, et souvent, vous voyez bien la liste des noms que je viens de citer, Sankara, Mandela, 27 ans en prison, Modibo Keïta, assassiné en prison, Lumumba, Sékou Touré, diabolisé, etc. Ils ont payé le prix, l'exil, la prison ou la mort. Évidemment, lorsqu'on considère la situation actuelle du continent africain, où on dénombre quand même beaucoup d'États faillis, utiliser l'expression. On a envie de se demander si vraiment ce combat mené par les pères fondateurs en avait valu la peine, parce qu'en réalité, le résultat aujourd'hui ne semble pas brillant. Non, je pense que ce serait injuste à leur égard. Ils nous ont bien laissé un héritage politique et surtout un héritage moral qui nous a servi de point de départ. Peut-être que ce serait, oui, trop facile de dire, bon, oui, rien n'a changé. Non, beaucoup a changé. Et puis, le fait est que nous sommes encore là, debout. On n'a pas réussi à nous exterminer. C'était bien le projet qui a échoué. Donc, nous sommes là, debout, et nous sommes pleins d'espoir. Alors, je ne suis pas en train de dire que, bon, ces pères fondateurs, ils étaient en quelque sorte qu'ils étaient parfaits. Justement, c'est sur ce point-là que j'aimerais vraiment m'arrêter, quoi. Où ils ont failli quelque part, et où ont-ils failli? Pour moi, ils n'ont pas pris, considéré à sa juste mesure la question de la langue. Ils ont, de façon assez inattendue, assez étrange tout de même, semblé croire que le prix à payer pour le développement de l'Afrique, sa libération, sa prospérité, etc., que le prix à payer, c'était, je le dis brutalement, mais c'est à peu près ça, hein, la mort des langues africaines. Oh, bien sûr, mais rien n'est simple. Je crois que c'était des leaders pragmatiques. Ils voulaient régler les problèmes de l'heure, quoi. Et les problèmes de l'heure, c'était la santé, c'était la nourriture, c'était vraiment, peut-être que quelque part, ils se disaient, bon, ça viendra. Et cela reste, je crois, valable à ce jour. Il y a toujours eu cette peur de réveiller les divisions ethniques en mettant l'accent sur la question des langues. Parce que mettre l'accent sur la question des langues, c'est être amené à un moment donné à faire un choix. Et je me souviens très bien d'une interview de Wole Soyinka avec Jane Wilkinson, reprise dans Talking with African Writers, où il dit, écoutez, dans mon pays, c'est Soyinka qui parle, si on essaie d'imposer une quelconque langue, ce sera une nouvelle guerre civile. Et je ne veux pas une nouvelle guerre civile au Nigeria. Oh, c'est peut-être exagéré, on n'en arriverait pas jusque-là, mais au moins ça signifie que le problème existe. Et donc, ces chefs d'État qui devaient assurer des équilibres, au fond, ont toujours été quelque peu intimidés par la question linguistique. Et quelque part, cela a été un échec. Et je pense que, voilà, oui, ils ont considéré comme un pis-aller l'utilisation de l'anglais, du français et du portugais. Ce n'est pas l'idéal, mais pour le moment, ça évite l'explosion. Alors, Cheikh Anta Diop et Ngugi wa Thiong'o ont été pratiquement les seuls à vraiment penseurs de ce calibre à avoir considéré à sa juste mesure la question de la langue, à la placer au cœur de leur réflexion, même si Ngugi quand même crédite Obiwale d'avoir vraiment le premier parlé de la question linguistique. Mais celui qui l'a fait avec ceux qui l'ont fait avec le plus de constance, en argumentant sans cesse, c'est Cheikh Anta Diop et Ngugi wa Thiong'o. Ils étaient de toute façon très clairement en avance sur leur temps. Et là où, en fait, Ngugi met fin au débat, au fond, coupe la parole à ceux qui argumentent contre les langues africaines, c'est lorsqu'il les invite dans Decolonizing the Mind à faire la différence dans tout langage humain, de bien faire attention à son caractère dual, double. Voilà, tout langage, dit-il, a un caractère double. C'est d'abord un moyen de communication pratique et aussi elle est porteuse d'une culture. Et il donne des exemples dans les pays danois, de Scandinave, Danemark, Suède, Finlande, où on parle anglais au quotidien, mais où, pour ce qui est de la littérature, poésie, roman, théâtre, même les journaux, eh bien, c'est écrit dans les langues du pays. C'est assez difficile d'expliquer pourquoi ce qui semble si évident dans tous les pays du monde, mais pratiquement sur tous les continents, à savoir partir de sa propre langue pour aller vers les autres, accepter. Je pense que les Asiatiques ne discutent jamais de ces questions, parce que probablement pour eux, ce serait humiliant d'avoir à justifier que leur langue est une langue normale. Donc, partout, tout le monde le comprend d'emblée, mais je dirais même sans avoir besoin de réfléchir à deux reprises. C'est seulement sur le continent africain qu'on trouve vraiment un si grand nombre d'intellectuels. Ils sont une majorité qui disent, mais non, on n'en a rien à faire de nos langues. L'anglais, le français, le portugais, ça va très bien pour tout, hein, pour la littérature, le journalisme, la vie pratique. Bon, c'est une question qui, au fond, qui nous est posée, à laquelle, pour moi, c'est un mystère complet. Hein. Voilà. Ça fait quoi? L'Afrique est le seul continent où les poètes, les romanciers, les dramaturges écrivent des livres que leurs compatriotes ne peuvent ni lire, ni même comprendre, s'ils arrivaient à les entendre. C'est Cheikh Anta Diop qui, en 1948, il avait 24 ans, très jeune. Quand pourra-t-on parler d'une renaissance africaine? Voilà, mais le doigt là où ça fait mal, et 6 ans plus tard, en 1954, avec Nation Nègre et Culture, eh bien, il enfonce le clou. Voilà, il a dû essuyer beaucoup de moqueries, on ne l'a pas vraiment toujours pris au sérieux, mais en même temps, il a été très, très influent. Mais la mode à l'époque, c'était d'être fasciné par la langue française, et de l'autre côté de la barrière linguistique par la langue anglaise. Ngugi wa Thiong'o a dû faire face à la même hostilité, mais évidemment, c'était dans un contexte différent. Quelqu'un comme Chinois Achevé, par exemple, s'est beaucoup moqué de lui. Est-ce qu'il faut dire, je pense que de temps en temps, nous ne devons pas avoir peur de nous faire mal en disant certaines choses tout à fait agréables. Nous savons tous quel grand écrivain était l'auteur de Things Fall Apart, Achevé. Voilà. Mais il a bien pu penser, parce que le phénomène de aliénation, rendre quelqu'un étranger à lui-même, le phénomène est tellement fort que bon, il a pu se dire que ce n'est pas raisonnable de la part de Ngugi de comparer le Ekegoussi de mon ami Jane, la langue Igbo avec l'anglais, qui est la langue finalement parlée dans le monde entier, de Shakespeare, de Chaucer et de tous ces gens-là. Oui, c'est vrai. Je pense qu'il a pu penser que tout de même, il exagérait un peu, Ngugi wa Thiong'o. Ils se sont battus tous les deux, Diop et Ngugi, pour la promotion des langues africaines à une époque vraiment où ce n'était pas du tout dans l'air du temps. On ne les considérait pas, ces langues africaines, comme capables de porter une création littéraire digne de ce nom. Je pense que l'histoire est en train de leur donner raison, puisque, et d'ailleurs, comme par hasard, c'est intéressant, qu'il y a vraiment au Kenya une telle effervescence autour des langues kenyanes, au Sénégal, une telle effervescence des langues autour des langues sénégalaises, mais c'est que Ngugi voilà, c'est l'héritage de Ngugi et de Cheikh Anta. Mais comme quoi les intellectuels, quand ils écrivent leurs livres, en fait, il ne s'agit pas pour eux de changer la société dans l'instant, dans l'immédiat. Mais en fait, au bout de 3 décennies, ben, on voit le résultat. Ceux qui connaissent la situation linguistique au Sénégal savent très bien de quoi je parle. C'est l'héritage de Cheikh Anta Diop. Hein? Et alors, il y a un point, évidemment, sur lequel je ne vais d'ailleurs pas m'arrêter, parce que c'est la question de la littérature de transition. Ngugi est beaucoup plus radical que Cheikh Anta, parce qu'il considère que voilà, les livres écrits par les Africains dans les langues européennes, bon, c'est ce qu'il appelle la littérature afro-européenne. Ce n'est pas une authentique littérature africaine qui doit être écrite dans les langues du continent. Bon, Cheikh a, tout comme, je viens de le dire que sur ce plan précis, Ngugi cite Obiwale, eh bien, ici aussi, on a deux Diop, Cheikh Anta Diop et David Mandessi Diop, qui, eux, ont une conception qui serait une littérature de transition, qui fait dire à David Diop en 56, mars 56, que la poésie africaine dans les langues étrangères, coupée de ses racines populaires, est historiquement condamnée. Voilà, David Diop est mort à 33 ans dans un accident d'avion, auteur très prometteur, penseur de talent, mais il n'a pas pu vraiment donner la pleine mesure de ses capacités. La mort est passée par là. Eh bien, c'est ici que débute la comparaison que je veux faire entre Ngugi wa Thiong'o et Cheikh Aliou Ndao. Comme Ngugi, Cheikh Aliou Ndao a toujours été mal à l'aise avec la langue des colonisateurs. Ndao est né en 1933, Ngugi en 1938. Ils ont commencé à écrire l'un en français, l'autre en anglais, avant de choisir leur langue maternelle, le Kikuyu et le Wolof. Un petit détail biographique qui m'a interpellé, on ne le sait peut-être pas assez, c'est que tous les deux ont fréquenté l'université de Leeds en Angleterre, à peu près à la même époque. Et voilà, je pense qu'ils ont pu s'y rencontrer sans se connaître. Mais ils ne savaient pas que, s'ils se sont croisés, au fond, que c'était l'histoire, finalement, littéraire du continent africain qui était là, en mouvement, dans un lointain pays européen. Voilà. Alors, maintenant, les comparer aujourd'hui, ça sert à quoi? Pour moi, je veux montrer que, en fait, Tchenjerai Ho écrit en anglais du Zimbabwe, écrivait. Kourouma de Côte d'Ivoire en français, Pepetela, lui, il est vivant, d'Angola en portugais. Que ça ne veut pas dire la même chose, que les problèmes que nous pose la colonisation, que nous pose la conquête européenne, aujourd'hui, ben, nous ne les vivons pas de la même manière. La seule chose à regretter, c'est que finalement, nous ne prenons pas conscience de ces petites différences-là. C'est peut-être à cause de nos blessures historiques. Voilà, la colonisation est passée par là, la traite négrière, les stéréotypes racistes, et ça nous donne envie vraiment de rester toujours ensemble. Mais en même temps, comme on le dit de plus en plus maintenant, ben, l'Afrique, ce n'est pas un seul et même pays. Ce qui est valable pour un pays comme le Mozambique ne peut pas être valable pour le Mali. Le Ghana et la Mauritanie sont très différents. Tout le monde voit ce que je veux dire. Voilà. Donc, Ngugi et Ndao ont commencé à écrire en anglais et puis en français. Et ils ont changé d'avis en cours de route. Et ils l'ont fait, et cela a demandé beaucoup de courage, beaucoup de conviction, à un moment où vraiment mais les élites intellectuelles africaines, ça les faisait rire. Ce n'est plus le cas aujourd'hui, hein. Alors, où est-ce qu'ils ont trouvé ces deux-là? Ils étaient jeunes, ils étaient inconnus. Où est-ce qu'ils ont trouvé le courage de s'accrocher à leur conviction de cette façon? Pour chacun d'eux, je veux dire pour Ngougi comme pour Cheikh Ndaw, il y a eu un choc initial. On a fait tout à l'heure allusion à la conférence de Makerere University en Ouganda en 1962. Voilà, c'est là que Ngougi, comme on vient de le dire d'ailleurs, hein, un des intervenants à ce panel, Ngougi, il est là, il est invité, il est très jeune. Il a peut-être 23 ans, je ne sais plus. Et il se dit, mais comment ça se fait que moi, on m'est invité à cette rencontre tellement importante des écrivains africains en langue anglaise? Et voilà, il y a Robert Chaban, qu'il avait lu en swahili. Hein? Il y avait, qui encore? Oui, Chief Fagunwa. Voilà. En Yoruba, pourquoi est-ce que ils sont pas là? Voilà. Et donc il a été choqué, et ça a été le commencement de ce qu'on peut appeler la révolution copernicienne personnelle de Ngougi. Voilà. À l'époque d'ailleurs, il s'appelait James Ngougi. Il va bientôt changer de nom, voilà. Et puis et se mettre à écrire en Kikuyu, ce qui n'a pas été très simple, mais finalement il l'a fait. C'était le début donc de sa prise de conscience. C'est le moment précis où il a compris que mon achevé, Pepetela, Piragodio, tant d'autres, Senghor, qui pouvaient être des écrivains de très grande qualité, importants, hein, peu importe le qualificatif, mais qu'ils ne pouvaient pas être considérés comme des écrivains africains. Pour Cheikh Aliou Ndaw, le choc initial, ce qui l'a poussé vraiment dans cette voie, c'est qu'il a lu voilà, un livre, il a lu Nation nègre et culture en 1954, il avait 20 ans, et puis le livre l'a bouleversé. Il n'a pas été le seul d'ailleurs. Il a bouleversé un groupe de jeunes auteurs, de jeunes intellectuels sénégalais, dans ce cas, qui se sont réunis à Grenoble et ont créé ce qui, dans l'histoire du militantisme linguistique au Sénégal aujourd'hui, s'appelle le groupe de Grenoble. Et ils ont travaillé sur le... Tout ça, c'est parti du livre de Cheikh Anta Diop. Et d'ailleurs, Ndaw le dit explicitement dans un de ses poèmes. Parlant de Cheikh Anta Diop, il dit, c'est son livre en Wolof, poème en Wolof, que c'est son livre qui m'a fait prendre conscience. Et depuis lors, je crois que j'ai fait quand même pas mal de choses importantes pour la langue Wolof. Eh bien, alors, Cheikh était d'ailleurs le Benjamin du groupe de Grenoble, qui comprenait des noms aujourd'hui très connus, Hassan Silla, Salou Kandji, Massamba Saré. Il paraît d'ailleurs qu'un certain Abdoulaye Wade passait de temps en temps, mais on ne sait pas vraiment s'il était membre de ce groupe ou pas, mais sa présence a été parfois signalée. Abdoulaye Wade, notre ancien président. Eh bien, là, Cheikh Ndaw, qu'est-ce qu'il fait? Il est le plus jeune, et je pense qu'aujourd'hui, on peut le considérer comme une espèce de trait d'union entre toutes les générations de militants linguistiques dans notre pays, le Sénégal. Parce que dès 58, il était là. Et nous sommes en 2022. C'est quand même plus de 60 ans de combat continu dans ce domaine-là. Et je crois que c'est le seul dont on puisse dire cela aujourd'hui. Alors, la différence maintenant entre l'anglophone et le francophone. Ngougi nous dit dans Rêver en temps de guerre, Dream in a time of war, que la première fois qu'il a été félicité pour un texte qu'il avait écrit, eh bien, il avait entre 9 ans ou 10 ans, et c'était un texte qu'il avait écrit, un texte d'enfant, bien sûr, qu'il avait écrit en kikuyu. Cela était totalement impensable pour le francophone Cheikh Anta Diop, au même âge. Pourquoi? Parce que dans le système colonial français, l'enfant, il apprend à lire et à écrire exclusivement en langue française. Sa langue maternelle, dans le cas de Ndao, le Wolof, n'était pas jugée digne d'être codifiée parce que, en fait, on pensait que ce n'était pas capable, qu'elle n'était pas capable de porter un alphabet. Alors, le résultat, c'est que il a été beaucoup plus facile pour Ngougi de passer de l'anglais au kikuyu que pour Ndao du Wolof au français. Et soit dire que bon, pendant le temps que j'ai passé au Nigeria, je me suis rendu compte qu'il y avait là-bas, de façon naturelle, hein, une importante littérature en Fulani, en Yoruba, en Igbo, etc., en Hausa. Bon, alors que à la même époque, dans la partie vraiment francophone entre guillemets du continent, c'est très différent. C'est le désert. Ce n'est plus le cas d'un pays comme le Sénégal. Bon, c'est le désert. Bon, en juillet ou juin, j'étais à Abidjan et là, j'apprends qu'aucune des langues de Côte d'Ivoire n'a été standardisée, n'a été codifiée. J'ai rencontré un auteur et il m'a dit, je suis le seul qui écrit dans une langue de Côte d'Ivoire, en Agni. Et je lui dis, mais comment tu fais? C'est pas codifié. Il me dit, mais j'écris juste comme je le sens. Donc, alors que bon, dans les pays anglophones, vous dit très tôt, il avait commencé à lire et à écrire dans sa langue maternelle. Bon, je crois que je dois sauter quelques passages pour ne pas...
Et aller vers la conclusion.
Oui, voilà. Oui, je viens à la conclusion. Bon, alors, jusque-là, évidemment, oui, c'est sera ma conclusion, en fait. Ce que a fait Cheikh Anta Diop, c'est que dès la fin des années 50, il écrit en Wolof un roman intitulé Bourtilène, mais il n'y a aucun moyen dans l'espace francophone de publier dans une langue comme le Wolof, le Pulaar, le Serer, le Diola, etc. Et il garde ça, il traduit, il le publie en français à présence africaine. Et beaucoup plus tard, grâce à Aram Fall de l'IFAN, c'est publié en Wolof. Et depuis lors, bon, il a publié environ 20 livres en Wolof dans tous les genres, y compris d'ailleurs un petit essai intitulé Esthétique et littérature en langue one. Hein? Voilà. Ngougi aussi, il a gagné de la notoriété d'abord en anglais, et puis il s'est mis à écrire en kikuyu, et c'est à partir du moment où il s'est mis à écrire en kikuyu qu'il a commencé à avoir des problèmes avec le régime, d'abord de Jomo Kenyatta, ensuite de Arap Moi, jusqu'à passer longtemps en prison. Et pour conclure vraiment, je saute beaucoup de passages. Je veux simplement montrer l'importance
de Ngougi dans l'espace, dans le mouvement des idées, dans l'espace intellectuel africain, sans distinction de langue, francophone, anglophone, lusophone, africain en général. Ngougi est très important parce que moi, j'ai travaillé au Nigeria, j'enseigne à des jeunes Nigérians la littérature francophone traduite en anglais, Mariam Abba, Eben Ousmane, et puis, bon, ils connaissaient plus ou moins ces quelques noms, mais bon, ils entendent parler pour la première fois de Césaire, ils entendent parler pour la première fois de Bernard Dadier, de Kourouma, et l'un me dit, mais pourquoi est-ce qu'on doit lire ces auteurs-là? Ils ne sont pas africains. Voilà. Donc, la question de la langue, vraiment, ici, on voit à quel point elle, dans l'esprit des jeunes Africains, elle se confond avec la question de l'identité. On est la langue qu'on parle et à force de lire les auteurs en anglais, de lire, voilà, des gens comme Soyinka, comme Fagouloua, comme je ne sais pas trop qui, ils pensent que pour être africain, il faut simplement s'exprimer en anglais. Et c'est cette barrière que cache vraiment Ngougi Wachongo, mais aussi, à sa manière, sans trop théoriser, Cheikh Aliou Daou, et tous les deux ayant été précédés par Cheikh Anta Diop, dont le travail reste aujourd'hui si important. Je vous remercie. Voilà. Le texte publié sera beaucoup plus long. J'ai coupé des montagnes de paragraphes, mais ce n'est pas grave. Voilà. Merci beaucoup.
Merci beaucoup, Boris. On reviendra sur ce qui a été dit. Et pendant ce temps, s'ils peuvent passer la courte vidéo, allons-y.
94 la woon xam nga ñeenti at yoo xam ne man wax naa ko léegi nekk naa prof de littérature nekk naa prof de philosophie nekk naa taskatu xibaar di bind ay téere booba sax tàmbali woon naa am tur bi ma demee ba yëg ne réew mi ma nekk tey muy Rwanda lu mat téeméeri fan ci 1994 weeru avril ba weeru juillet sulen bés bu yàlla sàkk fii rey nañ fii mais fukki junni nit waaw fukki junni nit bés bu yàlla sàkk amul bés boo xam ne reyuñu lu toll ci fukki junni nit yow nga ne fi nga jaar yëpp xaw ma communiste nga xaw ma lii nga prof de philo te yëgoo ci dara alors que bu accident de train bu ndaw amee Paris nga nekk fii jooy yow yaa koy jëkk yëg wala feneen ak feneen xoolal 11 septembre ni mu yëngalee jamono donc loolu da nga naan en réalité intellectuel africain du dara man ci laa xamee ne du ma dara loolu nag daal di soppi.
Voilà. Merci beaucoup. Merci beaucoup. Je voudrais qu'on commence par cet élément. On finit avec, c'est très bien ainsi. Je voudrais que, on puisse lancer les discussions, aussi en prenant en compte cet élément-là. Non pas seulement parce que l'auteur, seul d'entre nous parle enfin dans une langue africaine, mais aussi sur le contenu de ce qui y est affirmé. Et donc, la question que je lance, mais je prendrai les intervenants qui ont levé le doigt précédemment, c'est est-ce que la prise en compte de l'affaire des langues nationales peut faire partie de cette, je dirais, de ce discrédit de l'intellectuel africain finalement. Voilà, c'est ça, c'est une question globale. Maintenant, alors, je vois, il y a une main qui est levée depuis longtemps, Bukumba Mwamba. Après, oui, alors est-ce que vous pouvez désactiver votre micro et peut-être poser votre question en désignant le présentateur qui la question s'adresse en particulier, mais ça peut être une question générale à laquelle l'ensemble du groupe peut être invité à répondre. Donc, vous avez la parole. Ndei Kodoufal, vous pouvez y aller si vous avez, si votre micro est ouvert.
Bonjour tout le monde.
Bonjour.
Je vous remercie et je vous félicite également de cette belle initiative. Je suis très contente de pouvoir participer à ce débat. Toutes mes félicitations. Alors, ma première question, c'est une question de provocation. Monsieur Sommet, pourquoi vous n'avez invité aucune femme pour donner son point de vue sur la question des langues, alors qu'elle est très importante? Et moi, je me dis toujours que cette question des langues nationales, les langues nationales appartiennent aux femmes, parce qu'en fait, ce sont les femmes qui la parlent le plus. Alors maintenant, en parlant du débat, ma question s'adresse directement à M. Kilolo, qui a pris la parole en premier. Son intervention m'intéresse et m'interpelle, parce que je pense que par rapport à son intervention, il a résumé le vœu du colon, c'est-à-dire amener les Africains à avoir honte d'eux-mêmes, à avoir honte de parler leur langue. Et si on a honte de parler notre langue, on va avoir honte également de pratiquer notre culture. Parce que la pratique de la langue, pour moi, va de pair avec la pratique de la culture. Et donc, quand vous voyez bien, si par exemple au Sénégal, nous apprenons le français et que les Français font tout pour que leur langue reste, c'est parce qu'en même temps, nous apprenons également leur culture que nous épousons. Bon, Dieu merci, de plus en plus, on prend conscience et on s'en éloigne, donc c'est quelque chose. Maintenant, M. Kilolo, vous avez dit que pendant 1 ou 2 ans, vous avez entraîné votre esprit à penser en anglais. Maintenant, ce que je veux savoir, et c'est ça ma question, pendant ce temps, si par exemple vous étiez très inquiet, ou bien très fâché, ou bien très content, est-ce que vous alliez réagir en anglais ou en kikamba? Quelle était la première langue que vous utilisiez si vous êtes vraiment dans une situation où vous n'avez pas le temps de filtrer? Ça m'intéresse dans la mesure où moi, j'ai toujours pensé que notre moi profond ne s'exprime pas dans une langue d'emprunt. Quels que soient les efforts que nous fassons pour nous exprimer dans une langue étrangère, dans la langue d'autrui, notre langue maternelle ou bien notre langue d'environnement finit toujours par nous rattraper. Quelqu'un qui est très surpris ou bien très inquiet ou bien qui a très peur, je pense que c'est l'appel au secours. Ce n'est pas dans la langue d'emprunt. S'il est très content ou bien s'il est très fâché, même chose. Par exemple, je vais raconter une anecdote. En Allemagne, j'avais rencontré une compatriote sénégalaise qui est mariée à un Européen. Je lui avais posé la question de savoir si ses enfants parlent sa langue maternelle. Et elle m'a répondu en riant, je n'utilise ma langue maternelle que pour les insulter. Alors je lui ai dit ce que moi j'ai toujours théorisé, toi tu viens de me le démontrer. Parce que moi j'ai pensé toujours que notre moi profond s'exprime dans notre propre langue. Et toi, quand tu es fâché, c'est quand tu es fâché ou bien quand tes enfants t'énervent, tu utilises ta langue maternelle parce qu'en ce moment, tu n'as pas le temps de filtrer. Tu t'exprimes sincèrement, directement, ouvertement et spontanément. Alors là, on peut voir l'importance de la langue maternelle qui toujours va nous rattraper. La deuxième chose, je pense qu'on a été trompé ou bien on a été faible. On nous a montré que nos langues ne peuvent pas faire ce que les langues dites civilisées, par exemple les langues européennes, peuvent faire. C'est absolument faux. Maintenant, puisqu'on en a pris conscience, nous devons aller de l'avant. Aller de l'avant, ça veut dire, comme l'a dit tout à l'heure, M. Osotsi, utiliser les langues dans la sphère publique, se l'approprier. Ce qui nous appartient, qu'on le prenne avant de s'ouvrir à l'autre. Boris vient de dire parler, écrire, être le plus près de soi, c'est-à-dire utiliser les langues dans toutes nos activités quotidiennes, et c'est faisable. À part Cheikh Anta, notre plus grande linguiste au Sénégal, c'est une dame qui s'appelle Aram Fall Diop. Elle a écrit un lexique en informatique, l'informatique en français, anglais et wolof. Donc, c'est possible, ça fait en wolof. Cheikh Anta avait écrit un livre de physique-chimie en wolof. Donc, je pense que c'est un démenti pour ceux qui disent que les langues nationales ne sont pas des langues scientifiques. Tout ce que les autres langues peuvent faire, ça peut se faire également avec les langues nationales. Bon, je suis très contente d'avoir pris la parole ici. Le thème de votre débat m'interpelle dans la mesure où je gère une maison d'édition en langue nationale qui s'appelle EJO. Je suis également membre fondateur d'un journal en ligne exclusivement en wolof et j'enseigne l'écriture journalistique en wolof à l'université. Je vous remercie.
Merci beaucoup, Madame Fall. Il y a une deuxième main, Rukaya Fall. Est-ce que vous voulez poser votre question et ensuite on répondra de façon groupée?
Merci.
Madame Rukaya Fall, allez-y.
Merci. Est-ce que vous m'entendez là?
Oui, très bien. Allez-y.
Merci beaucoup. C'est Madame Rukaya Fall. Merci de l'invitation et merci pour félicitations à tous les orateurs qui sont passés. Et je réagis tout simplement à partir de la citation tout à l'heure de Boris. Boris, merci de ta citation sur Copernic. Pour dire tout simplement, on est bien de discuter des langues nationales. Et je pense que de plus en plus, les gens sont de plus en plus convaincus qu'il faudrait qu'on les utilise et qu'on apprenne cela à nos enfants. Comme l'a dit tout à l'heure Kodou, c'est tout à fait réel que quand on réagit instinctivement, en Wolof par exemple, on dit oui, Samandai, quand on a peur, quand on a fait quelque chose alors qu'on ne parle pas tellement la langue en Wolof. J'ai vu beaucoup d'enfants éduqués dans le français qui font ces réactions-là. Mais moi, mon problème est autre. Quand on a cette langue-là et qu'on continue à faire nos références scientifiques, nos références littéraires, en prenant justement les autres qui ont écrit dans leur langue. Tout à l'heure, c'était Copernic. Dans d'autres cas, c'est d'autres personnes. C'est pas parce que ça n'existe pas dans notre culture des gens qui ont parlé de ces sciences, de ces philosophies. Mais on parle notre langue, mais en prenant référence sur les cultures autres que notre culture. Moi, c'est là où mon questionnement est. Et je me demande, dans toutes les thèses qu'on rencontre, tout le référencement, c'est un référencement ou français, ou dans des philosophes ou des scientifiques français, ou c'est un référencement anglais, etc. Mais jamais, jamais africain. Et c'est là est un problème réel. Parce que si on continue à nous référer qu'aux écrits des autres, on a beau parler notre langue, je pense qu'il y aura quand même un manque. Et là, j'aimerais bien trouver une réponse à cela. Parce que je passe mon temps à chercher, je suis ingénieur agronome de formation de base, mais je suis dans toute cette dynamique-là, à chercher à chaque fois qu'il y a une idée scientifique qui est défendue, comme cette fameuse idée de Hippocrate. Hippocrate n'a pas inventé l'aliment, c'est la première nourriture, le premier médicament, c'est pas vrai. Donc, nos recherches vont dans ce sens-là, et j'aimerais bien qu'on me réponde sur ce référencement. Merci beaucoup.
Merci Madame Fall. Il y a une autre main. On va prendre la troisième main et ensuite on répondra. Votre question s'adresse quand même à l'ensemble de l'équipe qui a présenté. Et peut-être que cela a à voir avec la question linguistique, la question des références intellectuelles ou universitaires ou scolaires. Merci de votre question. Elle est pertinente. Alors, Walter Boya.
Thank you very much indeed.
Okay.
And congratulations for this very exciting event. I am a book publisher. I'm a book publisher in Tanzania and have been publishing in business for 50 years. 50 ans. The importance of Kiswahili is at least recognized as having the potential to be an African lingua franca. Even in Tanzania, where the language has been given a great political push, there is a very clear and unambiguous resistance by the powers that be to develop Kiswahili also to be a language of science and technology. This, as far as I'm concerned, is condemning the language to only domestic and political space, but not in the scientific and technological space, and therefore really not being serious about our languages as languages of liberation and development. There's a certain kind of hypocrisy embedded in making so-called African languages, but limiting these languages only to political demagoguery, but not serious engagement with transformation of lives of our people through liberation of education and knowledge. I just wanted to make this point to simply say, celebrating these big political slogans of development of African languages without investing those languages to be languages of science and technology is hypocrisy, and it will not get us anywhere. Thank you.
Alors, il y a encore une question, mais la personne n'est pas identifiée. Galaxy A20S, TS. Est-ce que cette personne peut donner son nom?
Allô?
Oui.
Vous m'entendez?
Oui, on vous entend. Posez votre question rapidement.
Voilà. Bon, c'est
facile, des réponses.
Je m'appelle Mbake Diagne. Je suis de l'université Cheikh Anta Diop, chercheur au centre de linguistique appliquée de Dakar. Mais j'interviens.
Très bien, posez votre question.
Oui, je voudrais faire une petite contribution. Une toute petite.
Allez-y.
Voilà. Je félicite d'abord les contributeurs, les exposants. Ils ont été tous pertinents et ils ont touché vraiment des points importants sur cette question des langues africaines et de l'utilisation, de la problématique de l'utilisation des langues africaines. Mais moi, je crois que ce problème doit être traité de manière beaucoup plus globale. Toutes ces initiatives prises par des personnalités comme Ngugi, comme Cheikh Alindo et d'autres sont de bonnes initiatives. Mais tant qu'on n'amène pas nos États, à élaborer des politiques linguistiques claires où les langues africaines sont aménagées pour la gouvernance linguistique de nos populations, je pense qu'il nous restera des efforts à faire. Voilà l'idée que je voulais partager, et tout en me félicitant d'avoir suivi vraiment toutes les interventions, de la première à la dernière. La première a été vraiment importante parce que moi, j'ai fait partie de ceux qui gèrent le programme d'éducation bilingue au Sénégal en tant qu'inspecteur général chargé de langue nationale. Donc, la première communication m'a beaucoup plu. It was about teaching. I think it was very, very, very relevant. And yeah, c'est ça que je voulais dire. Je vous remercie vraiment.
Merci beaucoup, monsieur. Donc, je pense que Kilolo aura la parole pour intervenir là-dessus. Donc, très rapidement, donc, les deux autres personnes, Taxaw et Nguessan. Et ensuite, on va donner les réponses. Soyez très concis pour qu'on puisse aller vers la conclusion. Taxaw.
Thank you. If you can hear me, ladies and gentlemen.
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah, let me begin by saying at the bottom of my heart, this is one of the most exciting ways in a long time. I want to sincerely commend and thank the centers for their exciting, illuminating comments. Let me begin my with the last speaker, Walter Bugoya, when he says that we are pretenders. I am Kenya. I am a professor of linguistics and languages at the University of Nairobi, and a poet and dramatist writing in Kiswahili. So what Bugoya says that we pretend that we are promoting African languages, Kiswahili in Africa, that we are pretending. I totally agree. I mean, we get very excited with Kiswahili in our political meetings. We silent when we talk Tanzania, but we need to finance funds beyond.
Your sound is not good. Can you hear me?
I think he dropped out.
Yes, okay. So, bon, je prends le prochain, Nguessan et Binam, et ensuite on va répondre.
Oui, donc c'est Nguessan.
Très concis.
Est-ce que vous m'entendez là?
Oui, vas-y.
D'accord, bonjour et bonsoir à tout le monde. Et vraiment, je vous remercie de l'organisation de ce type de rencontre qui parle donc des langues africaines, de nos langues. Et c'est vraiment une très bonne chose qu'on se réunisse pour parler comme ça, parce qu'aujourd'hui, on est en 2022, donc ça fait 62 ans que les pays africains ne sont pas encore sortis, en tout cas au niveau des langues, de ce problème-là. Et bon, moi, je pense qu'on est tous concernés. On est tous concernés, c'est-à-dire qu'il y a des personnes qui disent que ce sont les gouvernements. Mais les gouvernements, non. Beaucoup de gouvernements, ce n'est pas leur problème. Même dans la Constitution, ils écrivent que la langue officielle, c'est une langue étrangère. Bon, et donc, pour moi, le problème des langues, c'est le problème, parce que ce sont les personnes humaines qui parlent les langues. Donc, c'est les individus, c'est aussi à ce niveau-là le problème. Et là, quand je vois, par exemple, quand on organise des choses comme ça, il faudrait que, en tout cas, je remercie la personne qui est à la base de ça, mais il faut qu'on ait le courage aussi, qui dit, bon, j'ai cité un proverbe de chez moi qui dit, quand on est en train d'être piqué par des fourmis processionnaires, il faut sortir de là pour les enlever, ceux qui sont déjà sur le pied. Et donc, moi, je dis, il faut avoir le courage. Moi, par exemple, par exemple, de prochaines rencontres comme ça, il faut dire qu'il y a aussi la possibilité, par exemple, sur la fiche est marqué anglais, français et portugais. Mais déjà nous-mêmes qui organisons les choses, on se nie nous-mêmes. C'est-à-dire que moi, je dis, mais il doit y avoir par exemple, le Wolof, parce que la personne qui est en dessous, c'est le Wolof, voilà, ou le Swahili. Bon, mais non. Et il faut qu'on, déjà là, il faut qu'on commence à, quand on se réunit, déjà, ceux qui ne sont pas allés à l'école, comme nous, n'ont pas fait l'école, comme nos pères ou nos cousins qui sont au village, ils sont écartés. Voilà. Et donc, il faut avoir le courage de dire qu'on va commencer, même avec des difficultés, à parler nos langues. Voilà. Et moi, je vais me prendre au mot, c'est-à-dire que là, ce que je viens de dire, là, je vais l'exprimer dans une langue africaine que je connais. Voilà. Et c'est comme ça qu'il faut partir. Bon, alors, il y a Boris qui a dit tout à l'heure, il a cité un pays où vraiment le problème de langue africaine dans ce pays n'est pas du tout leur affaire, en tout cas ceux qui dirigent le pays. Il a dit, il a trouvé une personne qui parle la langue agnée, donc qui se débrouille, qui essaie de publier. Donc, vous voyez donc le pays. Donc, ce pays-là, bon, je vais parler dans une langue de ce pays-là. Voilà. Bon, donc,
Vas-y, brièvement.
Très brièvement. Bon, anengawe ya na ekan eklo wa aniriem ekambe unde indengame nsukan yeleke yo africain gouvernement otima mende oti eboy songame o africa siezu oti ngba kulani ende isoti se eyasana ekandengale onuke efa fangan na eke boya nyelianu ananga we nuke se njaboris ibomo oyolike okani wolof nu bon ikusuma anie konle me feke swahili ki ngozi kan ngale se ki on frère yanu kan ngale nu vie et qu'en français, anglais ou bien portugais, et quand il y a parce que les Kenyans savent qu'un amé Cheikh Anta Diop c'est qu'il y a ça c'est et quand il y a ou un nengawe un bakulanga et que quand et bonde et boya nyeli nous voilà il y a une kenga ça il manquant c'est qui on fait c'est il y a non et quand boya nyeli c'est et bana Boris c'est que ya na Swahili et quand bon mbe boye so ba inwa wolof ya et quand mbe boye donc nyam kla nyamu angba kla et africain mu nyam kla na kuliden était kuli bon donc je remercie tout le monde, je remercie les Africains, la lutte continue et merci beaucoup. Voilà.
Merci Nguesson. Binôme, et ensuite on répond. Binôme. Ok, bon, Binôme n'est pas disponible.
Hello.
Oui, ok, vas-y, 1 minute, s'il te plaît.
Oui, non, I will be very short. I will be short.
Okay,
I just sent a message to Professor Osotsi concerning the Simamil. We have something like that in Cameroon, Bassa region. We call it Konongond. We cut it at the beginning of each important ceremony. It was just my contribution. And if you, I post the name on the chat. And if you Google it, you will find a lot of pictures and even video on YouTube. Thank you very much.
OK, thank you. Donc, voilà, je vais donner la parole aux collègues pour répondre, mais je vais juste dire pour Madame Kodofal qui a demandé, enfin qui m'a interpellé directement, pourquoi il n'y a pas de femmes dans ce groupe. C'est vrai, c'est quelque chose que nous regrettons. Nous avons essayé, mais nous n'avons pas réussi à les attirer vers nous. Voilà ce que je peux dire pour l'instant. Nous n'avons pas réussi, c'est dommage. Alors maintenant, je donne la parole à notre jeune frère, Kilolo. Je crois que c'est à lui qui était adressée la première question. Kilolo, you can take the floor and give the answer to the question that was addressed to you.
Thank you very much. Indeed, my reaction in the first, whenever I'm faced with any situation that that is somewhat emotionally charged, I always react in my mother tongue. And I remember this even as when I was in primary school and we were being forced to speak in English, then I would get excited. We were always very afraid of getting the disc that say that you've spoken in your mother tongue and you're due for punishment at the end of the day. And one morning, my best friend had not come to school for like a week because they were sick. And then they came that morning and I was so excited and I shouted in Kikamba, you know, in appreciation of the fact that he's come to school finally. And the rest of the day, I was so afraid because I knew that I was due for punishment because of holding the disc. And I've seen this recur in many times, that even though for a long time I was forced to think in English and to kind of communicate in English, the most natural way in which I felt comfortable in my mind and in my heart was when I was speaking in my mother tongue. So that sense of shame kind of continues to stay because I associated this speaking in Kikamba to two things. One, the fact that I would be punished if I was caught speaking in that language, and two, the fact that if I didn't think in English, or if I didn't do my work in English, I would end up not excelling, right, and not being an excellent student. So that combination of punishment and also fear of not excelling in my school kind of made me carry that shame for a while until I made the conscious effort to kind of liberate myself in the way I related to my mother tongue, and continued now to consciously use that language when I'm speaking to people who understand that language. So it is a battle that we need to be very conscious about, and to keep put in that effort to be able to overcome what has been ingrained in us for a very long time.
Thank you, Kilolo. Okay, what I will do is we invite each of the presenters to answer this question in one or 2 minutes, so that we can stop this session in about 5-6 minutes. Donc, chacun peut, Aboubakar, puis professeur Osotsi, et ensuite Boris Diop pour conclure, chacun en 1 minute et demie, 2 minutes, s'il vous plaît, parce que là, le sujet est intéressant, mais nous sommes tenus par des contraintes de temps, si vous voulez bien. Donc, Aboubakar, à toi. Et merci encore, Kilolo.
Right, thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Okay, yes.
Okay, very good. Most of the questions are really around primarily maybe the sort of written language, written aspect of language, at least many aspects of them. I'm wondering if the cinema is not a bit different, in the sense that at least the question of sort of African languages and using African languages in the medium, with sound, with body language, with the image, etc., seems to have circuited some of the obstacles that the literary world might be facing in terms of institutionalizing the use of African languages in expressing themselves, in the sense that, with the moving image, you can obviously go straight to the national language. You can address anybody from the village to the city. You don't need any additional literacy to it, etc., etc. So that's one thing. The other thing has to do with, in fact, I have to come back to Sembène in some way, because in in many ways, the part of our problem, I think, if you look at Mandabi in particular, at least my sense, one of the senses I have, is that we have a kind of a linguistic state capture, if I could use this term, right? In the sense that sort of the apparatuses of legitimacy in most of our countries, access to power, access to knowledge, access to wealth, etc., are all filtered through, obviously, to a large extent, to the mastery of these foreign languages that we all have to inhabit, to use, etc., etc. And one may wonder whether, in fact, the lack of progress in institutionalizing and creating an infrastructure, because that's really what one of the things that's missing, so that we go beyond individual effort here and there, but having a systematic approach to really mainstream and therefore putting behind that effort both resources, technologies, and everything else behind it. May not be a combination of factors. One, of course, being almost a question of class interest. In the sense, those of us who went to European schools, part of our purchase and the power that we have to do with, in fact, having almost quasi-exclusive or semi-exclusive access to, let's say, the tools of the trade that allow us to be above, if you will, the masses of the population. And so to what extent safeguarding these interests is one of the unconscious mechanisms behind the lack of progress in the question of, let's say, legitimizing, mainstreaming, and disseminating African languages across the continent. Obviously, the problem that Boris mentioned, the multiplicity of languages, etc., exists, etc. The desire to construct a nation exists, etc., etc. But beyond this, I recall a quote by Sankara, who was saying once that, you asked me how to abolish the distance between between power, sort of state power, and the people. He said, well, for me, the situation is very simple. Just give power to the people. I'm wondering whether African languages would not transfer power from the elite. This is just the elite to, in fact, the general population, whether that is not, in fact, potentially a threat to these elites in some way. That's, in fact, a question for me. So I'll leave it.
Okay, thank you, Abubakar. Now, Mwalimu Osotsi, 1 or 2 minutes. Okay.
Yes. I'll start off by answering my brother Abubakar in how to transfer power back. And I'll go back to my, when I was completing my studies, and I went back home to study the narrative process within my community, how my people tell narratives and so on. And here I am, a PhD student. I'm with these people who are supposed to be my sources, but they are not acknowledged by the empowered English language. They are not acknowledged as intellectuals. So one of the questions I asked those three ladies was, what is a story? A story in Orunyore, the language in which I was researching. And they asked me, I had to use the language itself, Orukano. What is a Orukano? And they asked me, what kind of Orukano do you want? Is it Orukano the riddle? Is it Orukano the narrative? Is it Orukano the and they gave me a whole string of other things that demolished my poor thesis, because I was of the assumption that there was a direct equivalent between English as oral narrative, and of course, my group. In other words, I went back again to my mothers I tried to empower them so that they could teach me. And when I completed my studies, they told me, as I was completing my studies, they told me that you go there and complete what you are doing for those people, and then when you are through, come back and we shall teach you a language. That was my assignment. I'm a completing PhD student, and they're telling me, you are not educated enough. Are we humble enough to be able to accept from our people that we actually do not know the knowledge of our people, and that the best way we should go about this is to actually just go back again to our people and say, listen, we know English, or we know French or Portuguese. This is our language. As in Kenya, we say, lugha ya unga, the language of the flour. This is the language of feeding me, but actually it is not the language of fundamental knowledge for our people. We have to take that harsh decision at some stage and be very practical about it. And once we get into taking our languages seriously, then we'll be able to perhaps begin making these strides. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Mwalimo. I want just to add something because une dame, Madame Fall, m'a demandé pourquoi il n'y avait pas de femmes. Bon, c'est vrai, il n'y en avait pas aujourd'hui pour présenter, mais dans l'équipe, dans le groupe de travail, nous avons 2 femmes. Donc, j'ai parlé des travaux de traduction de l'une d'entre elles, Diane Bouchi, qui a traduit Murambi en Ekobushi, sa langue maternelle, et en Kingozi, dont Mwalimu nous a parlé. Nous avons une autre collègue qui est de Mozambique, mais qui n'est peut-être pas là aujourd'hui, qui a fait sa présentation la dernière fois. Maintenant, je donne la parole au grand frère Boris pour conclure tout ça. Voilà. Merci beaucoup.
Mais dès que j'ai vu s'afficher le nom de Rokhaya Dabafal, j'ai dit à ça, c'est ma sœur et camarade. Alors, la remarque concernant Copernic, au fond, je suis vraiment d'accord. Hein, mais nous sommes tous, il y a toujours ces traces quoi, qui ne nous lâchent pas. J'évite, je suis vraiment d'accord, autant que toi, ces références-là, surtout que, en fait, voilà, on dit Copernic, mais en même temps, est-ce scientifiquement établi? Tout le travail de Cheikh Anta, c'était justement de dire que les piliers sur lesquels reposait la connaissance, l'interprétation du monde en Occident, eh bien, c'était bien fragile. Donc, je suis entièrement d'accord et mea culpa. Merci pour la remarque. Je dirais aussi à notre ami Guessant, voilà, de Côte d'Ivoire. Là, je suis un peu moins d'accord. Pourquoi? Parce que peut-être que, bon, chaque chose en son temps. C'est-à-dire, nous sommes là, du Burkina, du Sénégal, du Kenya et d'autres pays africains. Nous nous exprimons en anglais et en français. Est-ce que nous avons vraiment le choix? C'est ça. En Wolof, dans des cas pareils, on dit « Liru diko diamonola ». Ce n'est pas ce qu'il y a de mieux à faire, mais ce sont les circonstances qui nous l'imposent. Mais pensez donc, mon frère Guessant, que tout le travail exceptionnel que Cheikh Anta Diop a fait en faveur des langues africaines avec Obenga, voilà, ils l'ont fait en langue française. S'ils avaient dit, ah bon, ben, un peu par intégrisme, hein, par purisme, on va le faire dans les langues africaines, peut-être qu'on n'en serait pas là. D'autant que vous savez, immédiatement après les indépendances, la question linguistique, il y a des pays africains qui ont voulu faire du forcing. Et bon, ils sont allés droit à l'échec. Je pense que c'était l'exemple de la Guinée de Sékou Touré. Voilà, tout s'est effondré en même temps. L'édifice qui était là en langue française, ce qui venait, bon, les langues du pays, c'est des questions complexes et évidemment, avec Sékou Touré, l'excuse que, bon, tout a été fait quoi, pour saboter toutes ces initiatives, mais le fait est que c'est normal, dans la phase historique où nous nous trouvons, que nous acceptions. Nous ne sommes pas sortis de la fameuse transition, que nous acceptions de nous exprimer dans les langues européennes entre nous. Et maintenant, pour terminer, hein, mon cher Yopo, on a parlé du rôle de l'État. Moi, c'est vrai, l'État a un rôle à jouer, et d'ailleurs au Sénégal, il l'a joué, la codification des langues en 78, et puis, bon, les centres d'alphabétisation, malheureusement, alphabétisation fonctionnelle, hein, et donc, qui était là une limite quoi, à l'expérience d'alphabétisation. Mais l'essentiel de ce qui s'est fait, il faut bien le dire, c'est venu des flancs de la société, c'est-à-dire des fortes individualités, inspirées souvent bon, par Cheikh Anta Diop. On a Sahir Thiam, on a Pathé Diagne, il y a eu par la suite des maisons d'édition, Aramfal, les éditions Papyrus, etc. Et puis, évidemment, dans les mouvements de gauche aussi, hein, le front culturel, tout ce qui était fait autour de ces langues-là, au fond, l'État restait très, très, très discret, bon, ne se manifestant pas, mais le travail a été tellement bien fait. Il y a eu Kadou aussi, hein, il y a eu Faro de Yero Silla et Bouba Diop. Et aussi, ça continue aujourd'hui. Hein. Nous, on a un mouvement qui s'appelle Fox Labi, qui a rendu hommage à Mamou Dieng, la première romancière sénégalaise de langue wolof, qui s'apprête dans 2 semaines à rendre hommage, un grand hommage à Cheikh Anta Diop. Donc, il y a des choses vraiment. Et puis maintenant, l'État est obligé de suivre le mouvement. L'État ne parle plus aujourd'hui que d'introduire les langues nationales dans le système éducatif. Moi-même, je suis un des initiateurs de l'introduction, oui, du Wolof et du Pulaar à l'université Gaston Berger, où j'ai enseigné le Pulaar pendant 4 ans. Après, je suis parti. L'expérience continue. C'est formidable ce qui se passe là-bas en Wolof et en Pulaar. C'est unique dans l'histoire de l'Académie sénégalaise. Donc, c'est des individualités qui font. Maintenant, l'État a des prérogatives. Et bon, ben, à un moment donné, il se rend compte que ça, c'est la demande de la société et il faut agir dans tel ou tel sens. Quoi. Voilà, mais merci. Hein.
Oui, merci beaucoup Boris. Je termine sur une note positive, optimiste, que moi je partage aussi, parce que comme j'ai dit au début, nous ne devons pas oublier d'où nous venons, parce que nous aurions pu ne pas être là aujourd'hui. Et nous sommes là, nous avons nos langues, nous ne les avons pas oubliées, il faut juste qu'elles soient mises là où elles doivent être, pour le projet que nous avons pour nous-mêmes aujourd'hui et pour demain. Donc, je voudrais remercier toute l'équipe de travail, tous ceux qui ont présenté, toute l'équipe de Cora, les traducteurs, tout en m'excusant du fait que nous avons largement débordé sur le temps qui était prévu. Mais bon, voilà, le sujet peut-être en valait la peine. En tout cas, merci à vous tous qui nous avez écoutés, qui avez suivis et qui ont contribué. Merci encore à tous les présentateurs et merci à tous d'avoir été là jusqu'à la fin. Merci encore.